All right. We're finally here, all you haters in the comments. Listen, we are fashionably late, and that's because the party doesn't start until we're here, because we are special divas. I want to open this
I was
up.
trolling about you guys being late in the comments earlier. If you go back. I didn't know that Jordan hadn't got the link yet, so that's not.
Well, believe it or not, it's
You
Luke's
should know
fault.
by now. That's the way I am anyway, right?
Even though I'm not Catholic, mea culpa, mea culpa. Okay. So I want to start with this quote by George MacDonald that I was convicted about the other day. And off camera, Jordan had a response to that already. And then Nate had another response. So we'll probably only live stream about this comment and get to no questions. But let's start there. So George MacDonald says, I will enter no debate to be the champion for or against mere doctrine. I have no desire to change the opinion of man or woman. Let the Lord himself teach them. And my only addition to that would be, this is increasingly becoming my life verse from the Epistle of James, receive with meekness the implanted word, which is able to save your souls. Because I agree with George MacDonald, and I'm going to talk about doctrines I have convictions about. Okay, that's what I have to say.
Yeah, all I was going to say was against a bad reading of that quotation, which I think Nate will correct as well in his own way, that if someone was trying to use that as a sort of anti-intellectual almost way to like shut down the fervor and rigor of these discussions, then they need to just realize that the same guy who wrote that also wrote the sermon Justice, which is a tour de force when it comes to like a Christian eschatology, among other things, and is extremely sophisticated. So I was just saying that, even though I think there's a kernel of truth in what he's saying here, and maybe Nate, you should just say your take, because I think it's probably what it is.
Yeah, I think what I take MacDonald to mean there is essentially he's referencing the frame problem. The reason he has no interest in entering a debate about it is he realizes the way in which people's opinion on people's mode of exegesis and their positions on doctrine are very much dictated by their frames.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's a kind of futility in and it's debate specifically that he's objecting to. He doesn't say don't talk about it, don't discuss it, don't dialogue about it. He says don't debate it. And so to me that the word debate like shines forth, because debate is an academic game in which you have to have a winner and a loser.
Yeah.
Which means that you've closed off the possibility of synthesis from the discussion, because somebody has to win and somebody has to lose. One person is right, one person is wrong. And so I think that's what MacDonald is saying, and I wholeheartedly endorse that.
Yeah. Right. So the two key words there would be debate and mere
yes,
doctrine.
Exactly. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
All right. So we talked about a little off camera what questions we want to get to, because there's probably way too many for us to actually get through in any sort of substantive way, unless we want to just briefly glaze over all of them. But Nate, you said you really wanted to get to Oscar's ones. Do you want to just start there?
Yeah. I'll go ahead and read them. There's a little bit of he gave a little bit of a introductory preamble to it. That's I'm not going to get into, but it was nice. It was some nice lines of poetry and a great MacDonald quote. Actually, since we were talking about MacDonald already, I actually am going to read the MacDonald quote, because he's quoting George MacDonald here. I'm not sure what the source of this quote is, but it's basically MacDonald talking about his only reservations in putting forth the position that he does. He quotes MacDonald here as saying, "The only argument I can think of which would with me have weight against this conclusion is that the revulsion of feeling in anyone who has thus sinned against the truth, once brought to acknowledge his sin, would be so terrible that life would never more be endurable. And the kindest thing God could do would to put such a man out of being, because it had been the better thing for him to have never been born." And I know, Luke, you'd mentioned in our pre-conversation doc, you wanted to talk about that.
Yeah, Judas is an issue that came up.
So I think actually we can handle that even though it's a quote from MacDonald, I think we can handle that as a question in itself before I get to the other question. So let's go ahead and address that really quickly, because MacDonald is specifically addressing this thing better to the idea of it having been better never to have been born.
Yeah, right.
Well, I mean, I think the first thing to say is that it's a comparative. Better compared to what? Compared to what Judas made himself. So if your options are be the one who is eternally remembered and ensconced into the contours of eternity as the one who betrayed the Son of God, handing him over to his executioners, and to such a point that it causes you to end your own life in the field of blood and remorse and agony, compared to just never existing, it's obviously better not to exist. So there's that. So I think, now, does that mean that there are no other options? Well, I just don't think that's what he's talking. I mean, he just isn't addressing that. It's not like this full discourse on all possibilities for Judas.
So he's not saying he's beyond forgiveness or redemption.
I don't see that.
necessarily.
What he's saying, I mean, it's a comparative, which means it's a direct comparison.
Well, we know where
what-
MacDonald stands. So what he's saying here is the only thing that gives him pause is considering this.
Yeah. So the other thing to say, I think, would be this. Jesus says of the devil in the Gospel of John that he was a liar from the beginning. And the words used there are like that loaded term of, from your archy, your principle. Now, obviously, we don't think, at least I don't think, that God created Satan as Satan, willed the sin of Satan, etc., right? And so it wouldn't be right to say his true beginning is as a liar. Rather, and this is a very deep and very ascetic philokalia sort of tradition, reflection on sin. But there's a sense in which when you sin, you don't just break a law, but you make yourself other than what you are, as if you have a different beginning other than God. Maximus says this explicitly all the time, but it's also in other saints like Saint Diadocos of Photiki, and it's an Eriugena. I think it's in the New Testament, right? Between which one are you, right? Paul says in Galatians, having made your start, your beginning in the spirit, do you now come to your end in the flesh? So spirit and flesh are sort of, as it were, provisionally dueling beginnings. Who are we really, right? And so if I'm going to give a fully theological read of this episode of, where it would be better for him not to have been born, precisely because his reduction, his annihilation of the beginning he's made of himself for himself in sinning and betraying God, does actually need to be destroyed so that he can truly begin and truly be created, which would be the other possibility then eschatologically that the Universalists will not highlight, like Bulgakov does in his book on Judas.
Yeah, I was just going to say, with the way you started answering that, when you brought up the thing about Satan, that reminded me of the passage in Bulgakov where he draws a distinction between Lucifer and Satan, and talks about the way in which Lucifer has to play a role in the redemption of Satan. So.
Right, and I think it was sort of an old. This isn't directly from Origen, but it was said of him, I think, by Methodius of Olympia, when he was asked, "Will Satan be saved?" He said, "Well, something like, of course not, because when he's saved, he's not Satan."
Right, that's right, exactly right. Yeah,
I mean,
which is basically what Bulgakov says too.
So
Right.
this, I don't want to go on too many asides, but this gets to one of, to me, the heart of this question, and I talked about this morning in my third and final preamble to this conversation, pregame. But to me, this gets at the question of the ontology of man. What is man? Like, what are they at their core? Because I think if you want to affirm eternal conscious torment or annihilationism, you cannot believe that the essence, the core of man, what they are, like what you said, starts in God.
Well, you have to have a notion of a person as merely an individual if you think annihilationism is somehow softer and more coherent than eternal perdition, because you have fundamentally misunderstood. If you think that you can remove a person from ever having existed without having a rippling impact on essentially everyone else,
Well, right. But essentially,
then
their core, their heart has to be not God, not the imago Dei, not an icon of God, not a divine spark. The essence of their being has to be not God, so that you can squelch it out of being.
Yeah, or, and this is something I said where David Hart and I have agreed very heartily. He actually liked this thing that I said, which was, I think in a lot of, especially the sort of free will theodicy of eternal conscious torment nowadays, is just another version of pre-existent matter. It's something that God is faced with, that he has to contend with all the way to the end, and might even have to submit to its own inherent deficiencies. Well, this is exactly the thought of, the reason why ex nihilo was formed in the 2nd, 3rd century was to deny that the ultimate expression of God's creation has to, as it were, be formed and formulated over and against some external set of circumstances, or in that case, right, matter's inherent properties towards which tend towards nothing or whatever. So that the ultimate product of God's artistry is something other than God's own will. It's like some mixture, like the best he could do with the one run through, I guess, that God has. And so I'm saying all that because this is where I do think it's very difficult to critique universalism, because if what you're saying is like God's will is something ultimately other than the salvation of all, like God isn't just will and order, or just like the game of play of free wills that hopefully he's got, his will sort of come out at the end, but he can't be sure. It's what he wills is like the perfect, restored, unified, beloved Luke or Nate or me or anyone.
The Whitestone name, maybe?
Exactly. It's the new name. It's God doesn't create an abstraction, in other words.
Yeah. We should probably move on to the next question. Huh?
Yeah,
all
let's
right.
do it.
So this is the first actual question that Oscar formulated.
Perfect.
He writes, if there is a moral dimension to salvation, then how can universal salvation be guaranteed? The Christian language of judgment, however you interpret this, seems to necessitate that whatever might be said about the end of all things, morality must be an integral part of it. The crux for me is the one that Dostoevsky presents in Ivan Karamazov's Rebellion. What's stopping Vanya from returning his ticket forever? If the personal relationship of each person with God and other persons and everything else created includes an element of moral judgment, then it seems plausible that a lot of people will not be reconciled with each other and even with God himself. God's theodicy cannot be either aesthetic or euphoric in the sense of his self-revelation being a love that blasts the consciousness of each person with something akin to beatific vision, making the person forget or not care about moral judgment by virtue of the sheer delight of God's essence. Judgment must remain a moral one, and considering all the evil done during the time preceding the end of all things, there doesn't seem a way of guaranteeing at least some people won't, like Vanya, refuse reconciliation on moral grounds. How to deal with this?
So if I understand this correctly, and Nate, let me know if this is what you're getting. The question seems to be basically, why isn't Ivan right? When he says, because he presumes universalism as the end,
right?
And then he says,
right?
Even if everything sort of at the end, the final episode or state achieved, is universally saved or perfected, the fact that the process required this young girl's tears, this child's suffering or whatever, that's what he objects to, right?
Right.
Is that, and so the question, so I think that's, a very good, of course, the question doesn't make a whole lot of sense if you don't presume universalism, Because if you don't presume universalism, then the answer is just, well, God just wanted, he did it that way, and who are you to question? But I want to take it fully seriously, and I think, as far as I'm aware, I take it in a way more seriously than most, because my eschatology, of which I just wrote a little bit of a sketch and an essay, about 8,000 word essay, but much more needs to be said. My eschatology does include the actual unmaking and remaking of all past tragedies. So I'm in agreement with Yvonne that if the process itself is eternally necessary, as it were, to achieve, as it were, the eternal result, and if that process, inherent to that process, is the sort of ubiquity of death, tragedy, sorrow, and suffering, then I do actually think he's right to reject it and return the ticket. What I would question is whether or not God's act of creation and the achievement of his overall product is actually bound to sequence in the way that whole framing assumes. There I will demur and say, I see no reason why the ultimate sort of, like, I don't think the end is just the last episode in an otherwise long chain of episodes sequence. I think the end is the perfection of all episodes on the line that we perceive as sequence. Otherwise, we can't say, like, any moment is equally the creation of God, as if God only has a will or an intention or a design for the end. But I actually think the birth of my children is also willed and is created from nothing by God. But that comes right in the middle, and then it's going to have so these are the things that I think it has to get, if we were going to think through that all the way, you have to be willing to bend time. You have to be willing to let go of what are very natural and ingrained assumptions about the act of creation. And so we could go into those details if we want, but I would just say, actually, my version of eschatology is in agreement with the fundamental, force of the question. I agree.
Right.
I agree. Right. Unless all those things are actually rectified in, as another MacDonald quote, right? Only good where evil was is evil defeated, or something like annihilated. I would say also when it was.
I would probably I don't disagree with anything you said, but I also might come at it from a different angle. And I would probably question the necessity of moral judgment.
Yeah,
I think that is a little bit more problematic than we realize. And that's a whole nother. That will get us into a big sidetrack. So I'm not going to say more than that. But
quickly though, Nate, hey Nate, is the point there that, like, there's a good, proper, or manifest in the coming to see the moral judgment that we can't lose, or, like, what was the point of that, do you think?
I'm actually not quite sure. And he does, okay. He also, like, reads into that question some idea that there has to be moral judgment, like, even in the eschaton. And I don't know that I agree. And I think that there's a way in which this is favoring law over spirit, effectively. There's no like, God's already made his moral judgment. It's in Genesis.
Right. Well, the moral judgment is just his perception of his own beauty.
Right.
Otherwise, there are things that God can't manifest apart from their contraries, like evil, tragedy, and sin. And unless we want to make those things conditions for God's own self-revelation in and as creation, which I don't, then we don't need moral judgment in order for something to be revealed that otherwise wouldn't be.
Right. Yeah. So, but it was still a very, very good question.
It was.
I
want to address a few things in the comments. So people apparently have not been paying attention to the structure of how this thing is supposed to format. But where are the non-universalists? Here's the thing. We solicited questions. We are going to address some of those questions. We are going to have a conversation. And then perhaps at the end, people that want to engage in good faith dialogos can come on, and we will do that. Perhaps
also just go to any local church and you'll find some.
non-universalists.
Yeah.
As if that perspective has been somehow suppressed or not heard out.
Yeah, we need to hear the perspective from the ECT
Well, and then I will
infernalist
also go back
annihilationist
to the
side.
MacDonald quote that we opened with. And remember, I wanted to focus in on the word debate because debate has a certain spirit. Would I have I have had a dialogue with a non-universalist friend of mine previously. It was a very good faith dialogue. You can go and watch it. It's on YouTube. I had a conversation with Paul Vanderclay.
I went
not a universalist.
I went to Catholic University of America to have a whole dialogue about this if someone wants to watch it.
Yeah. So
yeah,
it's like
you can find these things, and there's listen too. Everyone's asking questions that they want to engage with in the chat right now. I'm not going to do that because that is specifically not what I want to do right now. And I said that many times.
Because we have so many questions already, folks.
Yes.
There's a lot. There's 11 pages. So.
All right, Nate, go ahead. Do you
want to go ahead? You want to read the next one, Luke?
Sure. Are we going to do the next?
Oscar's question too. Yeah.
Okay, let's get there. Here we go. So does it have big words I won't be able to say?
The one starts with if salvation includes history. Oh,
right.
This is right up Jordan's alley too.
So if salvation includes history and therefore memory, how is universal reconciliation plausible in light of all the evil that has been suffered and committed preceding the end of all things? It's a fact that the history of a created being is what made that being who it ends up becoming. And since for humans, that history does involve a lot of evil and horrid trauma, how can heaven be heaven if these things must be remembered? Who can recall rape, murder, torture, etc. with bliss? And if one tries to solve this dilemma by introducing some sort of amnesia into salvation, some sort of heavenly, come on, smart people, lethe, where all the evil is forgotten, isn't this in some sense a divine get-out-of-jail-free card? And if God simply erases all evil from history, as if it had never happened, then won't he also necessarily erase every single person having been created by that history, since these persons will not be themselves without their history and memory? And also, if one posits that some things warrant destruction and others not, then doesn't one introduce that very sort of dualism that universalism tries to avoid?
So I'll begin with a reading from Gregory of Nyssa's first homily on Ecclesiastes. He says, if oblivion has overtaken things which were, do not be surprised, for those that now are will also be veiled in oblivion. When our nature inclined to evil, we became forgetful of the good. Which is really important because if we're going to tie our identity to the process of our own becoming as we currently perceive it, then you're tying your identity to evil. Unless you think everything that's happened is not evil, right? So we don't want to do that, I don't think. Okay, I'll skip ahead. The very last line of the homily says this: for there will be no memory of those things of them with those who have come to be at the last. That means the final restoration will make memory of evil things utterly vanish in our nature, and Jesus Christ our Lord, to whom be glory forever and ever. So we're not.
And this is actually something. The idea of God forgetting sins is something that's pretty like.
Yeah,
it's all throughout the Bible.
I was just starting to think of text.
So it is very much on point to what I literally just submitted this essay for this volume, and it's called "The End of Trauma: The Patristic Doctrine of Deification and Trauma Theory." So I was doing it specifically in the lens of trauma, because actually a lot of these same dynamics about the porousness of memory, especially around traumatic events, what one major thinker calls the unassimilable nature of a trauma, but also the unforgettable nature of it, is a sort of fundamental paradox that drives traumatic, compulsive repetition and all these other things that are dealt with or tried to be dealt with in therapy. So, but I think the principle is sort of similar. We can say, which is this. I don't think. Well, there's several things to be said, but one of the things I want to say is this. I think we basically often assume that God's act of creation, since it progresses and unfolds, therefore is confined to the line upon which it unfolds. I don't think that's true for lots of reasons. Gregory of Nyssa, famously or infamously has the sense of reciprocal causality, where he says, quote, in God's foreknowledge, God can, as it were, respond to what will be later future events by putting certain conditions in earlier than those events, even if those conditions turn out to be partial causes of later ones. I won't get into all that, but let's just say this. When God goes to create the world, it's not as if he's looking forward into blackness and nothingness and saying, what's going to happen? And then sort of like gradually working out what he's going to do. At least that's not my approach.
That's like open theism.
Right. Yeah, exactly. And I think open theism has certain truths that actually need to be dealt with, but I don't think it's the full truth exactly for, because it leaves out this other stuff. I don't think God is confined to time in that way. But then neither is his act of creating time confined to time. Which means this introduces all kinds of weird possibilities that phenomena might arise in the course of time, which ultimately are causal in a way that transcends or goes across events in time. That might sound crazy, but guess what? If you believe in the incarnation and you believe that even the Old Testament patriarchs are saved by the cross, then you already think
Isn't that like Interstellar when he's reaching through when they're going through the wormhole?
Yeah, exactly. So there's all that, right? But let's skip over that. I think we, instead of dealing with all the weird time stuff, which I think is interesting, I do think it's at least helpful to question some of the assumptions in that question. One would be, are we really, if I erase memory of past time, as say Miroslav Volf argued back in his book End of Memory, do I necessarily erase my identity? In other words, my personhood. I can see why we think that would be the case, because we basically don't perceive ourselves right now apart from our history as we perceive it, which includes these very often traumatic moments that consume so much of our time and energy and attention. However, I'm not sure I'm willing to sit with that assumption without questioning it. Because if that's the case, then there is no sense in which God could have ever created a world that doesn't fundamentally depend on evil, tragedy, and trauma in order to be realized. So we're back to Yvonne's objection.
Or is memory unalterable?
Well, memory too is also memory of. So there's no such thing as like, oh, well, we either erase our memory or we don't, right? And also I would add, if the events that we remember right now, which are tragedies and they're evil, are somehow able to be destroyed, then it's not as if there's something that will exist that you'll just forget about. It's that there's nothing there to remember. And then furthermore, the other point would be, I would argue that events, precisely because they're divinely willed in their truth, have depth rather than mere extension like on a line. And so I don't think tragedies happen and then what God will do in the end is sort of blank out the segments of the line that are bad. Rather, the tragedies covered over and prevented something that ought to have been instead. And what will happen is that the annihilation there, like a pruning, will be the preparation for the true event to come forth that never did. We sense this all the time whenever we say things like that ought not to have ever happened, or never again will this happen. Right, in our causes for justice, which is all good. But then what we're saying is we can imagine something that should have happened that would have been better than what did. If I can imagine that, I'm sure God can. And if God can, I'm sure he willed it because he doesn't will evil. And so there's something that God willed that is good, that the tragedy or the evil has covered over or temporarily or provisionally, prevented from occurring.
And those are the things that God will remember.
Exactly, and they will remember.
Which Sherry got me triggered me thinking that, because she dropped a very insightful little comment. She said,
"Sherry,
memory, yeah." She said memory is necessary for the apokatastasis, and she's correct. She's right, but it's the remembrance of the good.
Yeah. I mean, ultimately, there's nothing else really there to remember.
Exactly right.
So anyway, that's kind of where I would go. The thing I would say, just sort of as a last point on the question, if something like that isn't so, and if it really is the case that I almost, as it were, need all of my all of the terrible things I've either done or endured or both in order to be who I am, then I do think we just need to admit that there is something integral to us that's just fundamentally evil. Otherwise, the removal of evil will not entail the removal of me, because it's not inherent to me.
Right.
So yeah, I don't want to go down that road personally.
Well, in fact, yeah. Well, like our sins are only inherent to our unmaking.
Exactly.
not to our making.
Yeah.
All right, let's get back to these questions. We're going to finish out Oscar. Oscar, thank you for paying me personally and privately $500 for just answering your questions. I appreciate that.
Actually, that's all we have time for. No, I'm just kidding.
All right. Since salvation is a real process and not a magic trick, how can the option of eternal suicide be ruled out? Evil suffered and evil committed and evil seen takes a real toll, and it seems plausible that this toll will end up being too much for some people. Since God does not prevent such trauma occurring within cosmic history, there doesn't seem to be any metaphysical safeguards to prevent the consciousness of it from continuing post-mortem. Again, since salvation is a real process, and therefore suicide within this life is not a get-into-heaven free card, there is no radical spiritual cure that can do away with the necessity of the painful spiritual work required for reconciliation. This is a process that must freely be participated in, and I don't see how people cannot choose to freely opt out. Wouldn't Hitler, for example, here he comes, Hitler, thank God we got there. Wouldn't Hitler, for example, if the full extent of the consequences of his evil were revealed to him, choose, not out of ignorance, to not go through the process of painful purgation, no matter what the reward?
No, I don't. I mean, so there's this thing where we have become so enamored of evil because we think it's to be more sincere and mature, to like look at everything in its chiaroscuro hues. As with the actual painting technique, we think that makes you see the world in 3 dimensions.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm sorry, that's just fetishizing evil. I don't pay it that kind of heed. It doesn't mean I deny it. It doesn't mean I say don't deal with your stuff. In fact, I would say this perspective is more free to deal with all the truths and face them squarely, precisely because I will not absolutize them into the eschaton.
Right.
And so don't hear me.
That's very important. Rewind and re-listen to that point a few times. Yeah.
It's in no way to downplay that. But however, I will say this: God is light, and in him there is no darkness at all. God doesn't need darkness. God doesn't give weight out of some sort of feigned dignity that is owed to darkness, and we shouldn't either.
And darkness is not dark to him.
No, and all he does is dispel it. So I think there is a sort of temptation to be like, I'm a real mature person if I can face and I can admit something like, even if you could look into the face of God without any hint of ignorance, you could still reject him. Well, that's really just a different sort of, in my opinion, navel gazing, because it absolutizes your own power of free will as equal with God, who alone is eternal.
Absolutely, which is back to my question of ontology. What is that thing that can choose against God and its own being for an endless duration of time? So I've never had anybody answer that.
Right. Yeah. And if you say anything other than God who is love, then you think that
you're a dualist.
And that's
first of all, the being would have to be by definition equal in power to God.
Yeah.
Yeah, 100%, right. So
which is kind of actually one of the background, like, this is why to me it's like it's always been obvious to me that there is an idolatry of power that is at the root of most people's formulations of infernalism.
Right.
And it's especially subtly true of people who want to cling to the more modern, like, free will version of it.
Right.
It's like, as when you formulate it that way, then you make the human will something capable of being an actual, like, completely equal counterbalancing force to God himself.
Yeah. So, having said all that, right, there were several aspects of the question I would dispute at a fundamental level. However, I still wanted to say this. I do think there's something important in the question, which is why I assume you guys chose it, which is that it's absolutely right to say that salvation is a process, not a magic trick. But that's because love is a process, not a magic trick. What I see in the question is a sort of either or at work that says, well, look, either we're free or it's all just arbitrary. Well, arbitrariness and freedom defined negatively, neither of those capture love. And so love does defy a certain sort of impersonal law-like necessity, sure. And so it does initially appear almost antinomian, right? It's sort of uncontrollable in that sense. But it's not because it's unstable. It's because it's more stable than anything else that you call stable, including evil, which we sort of furtively absolutized in our very sort of strugglings. So, in fact, I would say that's a part of the allure of evil itself, is to present itself as absolute alongside God. And so the pure lure of power that sort of puts forth, as you were saying, Nate, is the thing, right? That's the temptation in Genesis 3.
Right.
So isn't, God doesn't want you to know good and evil, as if that's who God really is.
Right.
The sort of yin and yang, who is the whole and is somehow more real because he knows both.
Yeah, all of this was playing in my response earlier to the question, to the other question that Oscar asked, where he assumed like the necessity of moral judgment even in the eschaton.
Exactly right. Yeah, there's similar themes here. So no, yeah. So now, no, I don't think Hitler could see the. I don't think he can see the enormity of everything he did, unless he is no longer ignorant.
Right.
Because the very sort of, just like the Judas question, what Hitler made of himself and what he did to all those people, which he will have to rectify. It's not a magic trick. And the process of divine judgment is a process, but the process isn't unilateral. It will be, right, as your own words will condemn you. I don't think that just means words you said and they sort of uttered a prophecy unknowingly. It's going to be, you're actually going to have to come to your own judgment with God, agreeing that what you made of yourself was a travesty of his own creation, and that you will its destruction, the destruction of your false self, just as much as anyone. So no, I don't think Hitler...
I'm so glad you're saying that, because that's one of the other things that people who oppose universalism will just kind of like knee-jerk respond. It's like they act as if you're a universalist, that means that nothing is at stake and your moral decisions have no consequences at all.
Right.
But that's also clearly not what you're saying right now.
No, and I think a really full. To be honest with you, I can't really think of any universalist throughout history that would disagree with what I'm about to say, even though I know there's a lot of versions. But on this point, I don't see any disagreement. I think universalism demands the sincerity of the process more than anything. I mean, What kind of process is it that just lets somebody wander off in their own delusion so that they reduce themselves to something like almost nothing? Where's the resolution there? Where's the process there? Where is God? Is he just a spectator? Right. And it's like, no, what I'm saying is it's like the hound of heaven, that God will never relent until he gets to you, and through you and with you judges yourself past you, and then judges yourself to be worthy of damnation and annihilation, and then the birth of your true self through that. I mean, we're already doing that in the spiritual life. So I think that's a process that makes sense to me, but all these other ones are just sort of loose ends. This person's annihilated. This person is just forever locked into the prison that's locked from the inside. I mean, there's no resolution to any of that.
Right. So I don't know. I don't know if it's in the questions that we got. Actually, it is in the questions that we got. So I'll go ahead and ask this question. Let me check the document so I can attribute.
Luke just went to hell in the dungeon.
Well, that
was a personal production choice.
I know somewhere in here is a very simple question, which I actually think, what your answer that you just gave reminded me of the importance of addressing. Is there was someone who asked the question of whether hell was a place. And I wanted to attribute it, but I don't remember who asked it.
Yeah, I can't remember what that was either, but that's a common. We could just ask that.
Yeah,
question.
It's very common. So I think, that connects directly to what you were just saying. So, is hell a place? And then I would say, as a follow-up to that, if it's not a place, what is it? So, what do you actually believe about hell?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things I'd want to ask is what's a place?
Yeah, I knew it was gonna go there because that's what I
mean-
was saying to Nate yesterday. I'm like, a place. What does it mean to exist? What does it mean to be?
It's like, I guess people normally think of it as like some sort of container, like an
Yeah.
empty vacuum, and you just fill it with events and actions and reactions. But I think all that should really be kind of, thrown away as just so much sort of empty images. But I like, including now. I mean, where am I right now? I mean, it's a place in a sense, but really all places are conditions, which are no less involving your subjectivity and your own and the intersubjectivity around us as anything else.
Right.
Right. So place versus condition of the soul, I think, is probably a false dichotomy ultimately. But if I had to kind of emphasize, if I want to give it, I would say hell is the experience. Some people say hell is the separation from God. No, I don't think so. Hell is the experience of being separated from God. But since God in Christ is separated from the Father in dereliction, even separation isn't a place where you're actually separate. Right. Now, you do experience, and this is where I think Balthazar is right, and Mysterium Pascale, and the Holy Saturday theology, all that stuff. You do experience a kind of hopelessness existentially. And so the condition of your soul, if you want to call it eternal in that sense, like a negative sense, that is to say indeterminate. There seems to be no edges, no end in that sense, right? That perhaps can be experienced. I won't say yes or no about that. I don't know that. But I would say, that's so hell is that. I think a lot of people, I mean, I know this might sound glib, but I don't mean it. A lot of people already know hell here and now.
Yeah, no, that's exactly where I was hoping you would go with this.
Yeah.
Because the reality is that the reality is that all of us are saved out of hell. Like the harrowing of hell is something that's going on all the time.
But that is definitely a common misconception of Christian Universalists. Like, I mean, I've gotten that answer so many times of just like, well, I believe hell's real. The Bible talks about hell. And I'm just like, oh my goodness.
Yeah, well, it talks about hell mostly as annihilation. So unless they're annihilationists, they're already getting funny with the scriptures as they.
Dude, I'm so glad when people when smart people agree with me, my ego just loves it. It's so fantastic. Because I've said that before. Because I was an annihilationist for a while, and I've often said if you want to go just the straight biblical exegetical approach, it's 80% annihilation. It's probably like 19.9% universalism.
Oh yeah,
and there's like two texts that are tough.
Even Bulgakov praises the exegetical expertise of annihilationists before he moves on to destroy the position.
I mean, it's a very exactly. No, I mean it is. It's a very good case. Chris Date. There's some people out there that they make very good cases. I mean,
he was the reason I became an annihilationist. And related to this, I'm just highlighting this because where did that definition of hell, separation of God, come from? In order to make sense of ontology and absolutizing evil, probably.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's like an initial, maybe innocent sense where it's like, look, when you say you're separate from God, what it means is to say you're in a state that is not directly experiencing all God is: love, mercy, infinite joy. And so there's a kind of like innocent sense of like, I'm separated from God insofar as I remove myself from the benefits and graces that God himself is and bestows. But it's one thing to say that, and it's another thing to say like some kind of metaphysical sense, you like there's some place that God doesn't apparently create that somehow you're still real.
You're a dualist. Right?
Yeah. Right. Yeah. And so it's, I just think that part is a little bit like if you make too much of the language there, I think that's where you go into problems. But there's nothing wrong with saying like, like how often, I mean, don't we always say like today, like I'm feeling sort of distant from God.
Right.
I feel like I'm not, what do we mean? I'm not connected. I'm not like experiencing, am not properly cognizant of the goodness God is today or whatever. Right. And that's all fine. That's innocent. There's nothing wrong with that. It's just that if you're going to say that, if you're going to make some like stronger absolute claim that, there's a literal place somewhere and some when that isn't sourced by God or, and sort of we create it. And it's like a metaphysical like container or something. That's just sort of, that to me is sort of nonsense. But Or might say, again, even though somebody I think in the chat was really upset about this, but of course the Catholic Church in no way has denigrated Balthasar's theology of Holy Saturday. So if you're going to be really scrupulous about it, you should at least pay attention to what the Church says. But he says, as does Ratzinger in another spot, that hell in a sense is a Christological category, by which they mean Christ harrowed hell. Christ knows what it is to be in the state or condition of hell. Maximus thinks that too. So anyway, there's like
Jesus
maybe
went to
there's
hell.
That is the perfect transition to get to the Maximus text that we're so we have a gentleman from Cyprus who goes by the name Upcycle, who's an Orthodox Christian, who submitted a rather lengthy essay written by a former Universalist explaining like why they're no longer a Universalist. The article was heavy on biblical exegesis. I didn't have time to read the whole thing, but I did skim the text enough to notice that there were some quotes from Maximus. And so it seemed crazy not to get Jordan to opine on texts from Maximus that were included within something that was submitted for this. So, Luke, do you want to read the quote from the? It's at the very bottom of the document
From Harris?
under the heading Upcycle's article.
Oh, yeah. Let's get there. Oops. Upcycle, Nathaniel, MJ. Oh, right here? Upcycle's article. Okay.
Yeah.
So, is this showing up? Yeah. All right. I'm going to zoom in a little. So, as then voluntarily activity makes use of the potentiality of nature, either in accord with nature or against nature, it reaches nature's limit of well-being or ill-being. This is ever-being, in which the souls have their Sabbath, receiving rest from all motion. The eighth and first, or better, the one and endless day, is the unadulterated, holy, radiant presence of God, who comes after things in motion have come to rest. It abides totally in the appropriate way for the total being of those who have freely used the structure of their being in accord with nature, and bestows on them ever well-being, by giving a share in itself, because it alone, properly speaking, is and is forever and is good. But for those who freely have used the structure of their being contrary to nature, it properly bestows not well-being, but ever ill-being, since well-being is no longer accessible to them who have taken up an opposing stand to it, who have no power at all to move after the revelation of what has been sought, the revelation to seekers of the goal of their seeking. The responses to Thalassios.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I mean, there's basically two texts in all of Maximus' writings that, actually it's really primarily one, and it's this one, but that use the phrase ever ill being. A few notes about that passage in particular just read. One is that notice that it says it's nature's limits. Well-being or ill-being according to nature's limits. I almost never see in any of the discussions about Maximus on Universalism any discussion about what Maximus think nature is. If you were to do that and look at all the other texts that are relevant to that question, you will find many answers, but two of the relevant ones are these. One is that he doesn't think that the totality of, say, human nature is separable from the totality of all human beings. In a sense, it's what's called the collective universal. It's in Gregory of Nyssa, particularly if you want to look at like in Illud, his exegesis of 1 Corinthians 15. He makes this into the totus Christus. That's why he said in the homilies on Ecclesiastes that our nature is our Lord Jesus Christ. So the totality of the body of Christ really is the fullness of humanity. And so in that sense, the fullness of human nature. So there's a collective sense to nature. But then there's also the sense in which nature, it never fully approximates to persons. This is straight up from Christology, person and nature, they differ in some respect, even if they're inseparable. So what I think is where you ultimately have to go is you notice in this text that the limits there are natural limits. And in that sense, I think Maximus does make room for, again, the experience of hell. right? Like you can get to it. You can almost reduce yourself to such a point that you're almost entirely opposed to your own nature, which would be almost a complete deprivation of your nature, right? Almost, though, of course, is the key thing, because he doesn't actually think you can ever fully do that, as he says, like in letters 6 and 7, elsewhere on a different topic, that if you removed all the characteristics of a nature, you would simply destroy it. So, which is to say, you would destroy the subject itself too. So anyway, there's all this like metaphysics around there that would really be for a fuller discussion on Maximus. You'd have to get to the nature, the metaphysics of nature in person. But let's just go to the more quick, easier thing. The other thing that basically no one ever brings up when they talk about Maximus and these things is that his use of eternity is remarkably elastic. It does not mean a fixed, perpetual, unending series. I'll give you 2 examples. First, in Ambiguum 10, he claims that the death and resurrection of Christ, quote, generated eternal life. And he uses the stronger sense of made it come into being. So eternal there does not mean like the way God is eternal, who has no beginning, no end, anarchic. It means like it's something that can come into being. But the way it comes into being is not like we normally experience generation and corruption, which is this realm, right? But the more interesting thing is not only does eternity in that sense have a beginning, which would seem counterintuitive, it can also be broken or reversed, that state. So I'll just read from what I think probably Nate was hoping I'd read from. This is from the same work, Questions to Thalassius, Responses to Thalassius. This is actually question 64, paragraph 7. And hey, guess what, guys? It's about the harrowing of hell. Wow. Isn't that interesting? Okay, so I'm going to do a sizable paragraph, but I think it's worth getting the full context here. Quote, for our Lord and God himself became man and entered into the ocean of our life. He's doing this allegory of the Jonah story. He entered into the ocean of our life as if descending into the sea of this life from the heaven of Joppa, which translated means contemplation of joy. He quotes some scriptures. He even willingly descended into the heart of the earth where the evil one had swallowed us through death and was keeping us prisoners. Well, what does that sound like? Seems like hell. And when he snatched us away through the resurrection, quote, he led up the whole of our captive nature to heaven, which just 2 paragraphs before he had defined as all human beings. So he led up the whole of our captive nature to heaven, and he is truly our rest and our healing and our grace. Rest because through his brief life, he abolished the law of our dire slavery to the flesh. Healing because through his resurrection, he healed us from the wound of death and corruption. And grace, because through faith he distributes adoption in the Spirit of God the Father and the grace of deification to each who is worthy. So there's still the process of becoming worthy. Here's the key part. For it was necessary, truly necessary, I say, for the light and power of God to enter into that land of darkness and eternal bars. Imochli iinii. Iini, Ionias, some people say, right? Eternal bars, so that dispelling the darkness of ignorance, inasmuch he's the light of the Father, and look, breaking the bars of evil, inasmuch as he is the inhypostatic power of God, he might free our nature, which the devil had cruelly bound in these conditions, giving it the inextinguishable light of true knowledge and the unshakable power of the virtues. So, and by the way, if you just really keep in tabs and you want to really know the exegetical argument here, if you were to go back 1 paragraph, he's also defined these bars. Here we are. Eternal bars, quote, are the innate attachment to material things, which is the condition of sin. So our innate attachment to material things, our inclination to sin, can both be eternal, aionios, and broken by Christ's descent to hell. So if we're going to have a full consideration of Maximus's theology, you have to consider not only the metaphysics of nature and person, and therefore calling something a limit of nature is not necessarily calling it a limit for persons. And then you also have to take into account the actual act and event of the incarnation of God, all the way to the depths of his harrowing of hell, which makes something possible that perhaps to us who are under the gloam of sin and deception, we think is impossible. And that's precisely what he says. So there can be bars that are both eternal, binding us eternally, and broken by the power of God. And that's what I think a universalism commends.
Nice. So that's like, I mean, there's a question I want to get to with that, but that's really good. Christ, yeah, if you're going to say Christ descended and Christ went to hell and broke out of there.
Yeah, and he didn't just go down there to like hang out or to survey the place. He went down there to free, quote, the whole of our captive nature, which is in all persons for him. I mean, Maximus doesn't separate those. So.
Should we pull up the icon of the resurrection?
I thought my Calvinist friends told me that he just went there to gloat.
Well, maybe he does gloat over Satan.
I love my Calvinist friends. I love you. It was just easy. It was just too easy to not say.
By the way, I just wanted to cover my bases. If you're still questioning whether or not my interpretation of human nature as the collectivity of all human beings is right, you could just go 3 paragraphs later to question 64.10, which says, and when the word of grace is proclaimed in this manner, it not only persuades the king to believe in God, but also the men of the cities, commenting on those parts. Those human beings, in other words, who constitute human nature.
Well, yeah, but the thing, like, there's a way in which, like, that kind of acknowledgement of inherent collectivity is just like, you have to admit that in order to have any real understanding of what kind of beings we are as persons. That's why that's actually one of the ways in which annihilationism falls apart, because it's like any one sinner, no matter how terrible they are, if you eliminate that person from ever having existed, the ripple effects of that are going to have far-reaching consequences beyond what you imagine. You have to be thinking of the person as merely an individual in order to think that's coherent.
Yeah, like Hitler's mother, right? That
right.
Sort of
yeah,
thing.
that's the one. That's the example I always use. Yeah, Hitler had a
So
mother.
let me do an administrative thing. I want to do at least one more other question that I was thinking of, unless you guys have more you want to cover. And then I was thinking about selectively
Letting
and
people
with
in.
discernment opening this up.
Sounds good.
That's good. Yeah. If there's a question that you thought was really good, Luke.
So I think one that's just fundamental, and McMo I see is in the comments now, and he asked this, but and I think this connects a lot of things. So like in the garden, what does it say? What does it mean when it says, in the day you eat of it, you shall surely die? What does you shall surely die mean?
It means to put it sort of polemically, it seems to me, at least, that one of the things it means, it probably means a lot of things, but one of the things it means is that if you think you need to experience the contrary of God in order to become God, which is the actual temptation there, to become like God, you got to do it this way, right? You have to become a knower of good and evil. Then you will become like God. And that's what God doesn't want, actually. So there's a sense of judgment on God's character that he's begrudging, as Irenaeus said. He's withholding something from you that he promised. But then there's also a sense of this is the way you become fully God. So there's a definite picture of God as sort of the whole of light and dark. And so I think insofar as we think we have to do that, like that we need this sort of thing, then all it leads to is its own demise, to death. So in that day is in every day. People die every day. We die differently in different ways every day, and we do it all under the sort of under this realm of sin. I mean, it's what Paul calls the reign of death. So
yeah, we need to become a living sacrifice, right? Nate, I muted you, by the way, because I don't know, is somebody vacuuming at your house? What's going on?
Yeah, the cleaners are here.
Okay. All right, I'm gonna selectively open this up. We can address other comments or just say whatever kind of other things, but we'll see. Listen, if We're going to be nice. We're not going to talk over each other. We're going to talk about hell because that's what the stream is about. But I would love further up, further in, constructive opponent processing conversation. It'd be great. So have at it, haters of love and universal reconciliation. But don't you think to some degree, I say that as a joke, but don't you think to some degree that that people want justice to be merely punitive wrath versus actual forgiveness? I think that's kind of got to be behind a lot of the elevation of no conscious torment or annihilation, for that matter.
Yeah, I mean, look, I want that. I mean, who doesn't want that as a first visceral reaction to anything truly evil? Of course you want that. But look, here's the thing I always say about that. Even if you're not a universalist, do you believe in grace? What about those that come at the 11th hour and they get paid the same wage as everybody else? And that parable ends with, "Are you envious because I am generous?" Look, it's not about you. It's not about what you want in your sort of momentary, honestly and often legitimately wounded desires. It's about whether or not God is good enough, wise enough, capable enough, wily enough, perhaps, to effect exactly what he desired. I mean, that's right.
Well, and that gets one comment on that, and then Mark, I want you to chat. More and more, my buddy Jason has been, who some of my friends call the TLC's greatest theologian. So you got your work cut out for you. Jordan, you're good. I don't know if Jason's pretty good, but he's starting to see more and more everything in light of God's forgiveness. And I think even MacDonald said that. Didn't he say that Jesus is God's forgiveness? But I'm starting to think like the unforgivable sin is unforgiveness, because Father, forgive them as they forgive those who trespass against them. I think that's what salvation is everyone forgiving everybody.
It's at least inherent to that. Otherwise, salvation doesn't really preserve anything worth preserving.
Yeah.
It just preserves brokenness.
All right, Mark, what up, buddy?
Well, I'm not going to make. I don't know if I'm a good for the opponent processing bit, but I'm not sure the terminology is well defined yet. I mean, if as I said in the chat, how can you be separated from that which is omnipresent? So the idea of hell as a eternal separation, God is as much in hell as he is in heaven, as he is here. So that, as a definition, kind of falls apart for me. I understand the argument that hell contradicts God's nature, as God is love. But I just can't. I'm uncomfortable with hard lines on either side. You say I won't worship a God who will punish people for all eternity. Well, what's the difference than an atheist saying I won't worship a God who will give a child bone cancer?
Well, so I want to do these one at a time, because I think otherwise it's going to get out of control. So we'll try to respond to that briefly, and then I'm going to say goodbye. We can have further conversations and let Julian in. But this is a troubling thing that I have. So to add to what you said, and then to see what Jordan has to say, or Nate and I have had very passionate disagreements about Abraham and Isaac, for that matter, because Nate and I have disagreed on Nate and I agree on a lot, but sometimes we disagree. And this is one where when Abraham commanded the sacrifice of Isaac, Nate, at least previously, has said adamantly that he thinks that if Abraham believed he wanted him to actually kill him, then that's serving a moral monster, essentially. And I think in a weird kind of, I don't know, paradoxical Kierkegaardian way, and we'll get Julian in here with some Kierkegaard maybe, I think it was essential that he did think that's what God commanded of him. And that's a conviction part of me, because to your point, it's where I've come back around having a little bit of grace for Calvinism, or I've come back around having a little bit of grace for people with alternate understandings of hell. I can't deny my conscience and my convictions about how I see these things. And maybe God ultimately is good in some way that where I'm standing right now seems morally abhorrent. But I can't call that good.
So for me, I think in terms of the omnipotence or omnipresence point, God's presence isn't just a neutral there. God is present in certain ways. And so I have no problem saying that God, as long as anyone is in hell, God is in hell, but that doesn't mean God is in hell forever, because the point of being in hell for God is to destroy it. God can be present as judge. God can be present as this or that. I mean, in 1 Corinthians 11, when Paul's talking about the Eucharist, he says, you eat and drink judgment on self. He's presuming the presence of the Lord, but it's just experienced as judgment. So I don't really see any problem there at all. I mean, I don't think God is just sort of like sterilely present, neutrally indifferent, extrinsic, another partner in the presencing among others. So I don't see that as a problem. Now, as to the question about what's the difference between the atheist and the universalist, well, it's the difference between time and eternity. It's the difference between something that can be followed by goodness and the in principle affirmation of an absolute tragedy, which never could in principle be followed by anything else. So I think that the atheist is justified very far in having a difficult time in believing in God in this life. But that proves exactly the opposite of what you were just saying, Mark, because then if you absolutize the evil into an eternal perdition, there I think my faith breaks. I have a hard enough time hanging on to it now whenever the evils are provisional.
Well, what's the difference between absolutizing the evil and absolutizing your concept of what is good? It's that both are human constructs that become a form of idolatry. You're telling God what God is, as opposed to simply accepting that we as human beings exist within space-time and must deal with God as we encounter him, as we see in Isaiah 47:5.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's just as much a human construct to say God is that being about which we can never apply human constructs. You're just doing it negatively, but it's no less your judgment. This is why the church fathers had no problem saying that one of the criterion for exegeting scripture was theoprepes, whether it's worthy of God. That's not presumption. That's actually just belief that God is good.
Yeah.
Otherwise, we just don't know God at all. I mean, it's just sort of one or the other.
I think we'll have to close it at that, but I think that's true. And I'll quote Rob Bell, as God is he about whom we must never speak, and we must always keep speaking. All right.
I would say, like Mark, I would say that the position that you were advocating implicitly there is just an argument for nihilism.
And we'll table that for later. That's going to be spicy.
Well, see, okay. That's okay. See, you throw a word like that around, it's just a way of dismissing me and saying, "Oh, you're just a nihilist." That's an argument for nihilism, as if these problems were so easily solved, Nate, you wouldn't be wasting your time with all of these discussions on the subject.
Okay, gentlemen.
So, I mean, that's trivial.
If you don't
another time.
Yeah, let's do it another time.
If you don't assume that reality is intelligible in some way, you're advocating nihilism.
Okay, sorry guys. Sorry.
That's assuming we are purely rational beings and that's how we engage the world. That's not reality.
Okay, future conversation. Nate, Mark,
you
Parker,
presume the bottle of knowledge that I do not hold.
Please. Okay, here we go. We're gonna go with Julian. All right, here we go. And Mark, you can come back later with a different question. That one's done. Sorry.
Mark, you're a good Kantian.
Yeah, that was pretty spicy. I don't know if I have, any big objections or anything. I think I'm broadly sympathetic to something like hopefully universalism. I think I would I'm the kind of guy who doesn't like the kind of we can know this. And I guess that's where I think I sometimes find myself uncomfortable with some universalist ways of expressing themselves, because it seems like as a kind of grand vision, universalism kind of ends up taking on a posture that to me seems to kind of alienate me from my humanity, in a sense, where you're kind of thinking of the whole sweep of human history and kind of this cosmic perspective. And I sort of like to think more in terms of, my human limitations, and kind of, does that kind of make sense as an objection? That to me, universalism sort of just seems too universal, I guess, and too abstracted from my kind of existential location as a particular human being and the limitations of knowledge and perspective. And then this kind of gets into something like, I know for some universalists, this also kind of becomes more of a, I know this is something slightly different, but this is true in Luke's case. It also leads to a kind of perennialism, which to me has a similar kind of problem of this sort of universal perspective. I don't know. I wonder how you guys would react to something like that.
Perennialism conversation is a totally different one. That's complicated. I mean, it's related, obviously, but.
Well, I would make a few, I guess, philosophical points, maybe. I think there's a way in which, as Julian Rose points out in her book, The Broken Middle, that those that are supposedly fragmentary thinkers and who are attentive to the particularities of finitude and so forth, subtly absolutize that very perspective, so that the fragment becomes a new absolutization. And so you'll say things like, right, not you, but I mean, people, those sorts of people will say things like, we always only have X amount of insight into this or that. Well, as soon as you say that, then you've actually crafted your own synthesis in the form of anti-synthesis. So what I think this means is that she would say, Rose says that they postulate their own absolute beginning or starting point without ever mentioning it. And so it's a sort of Hegelian critique of that sort of, really she's critiquing postmodern philosophy, but I think it sort of has the broader swath there. I don't think we really can avoid doing that. I would say it's a part of the dynamism of human rationality and history at all to do that. Now, just as C.S. Lewis would say at the end of Discarded Image, we always are doing that. We're always making these models, of course. And so I guess I don't see it as a very, I don't see it as much of a critique of like universalism in particular, as much as it would be a critique of just human knowing in general. And on those, yeah, so I would just have philosophical problems with that. I have phenomenological problems with that, because a truly fragmentary, if you were really committed to that, we would also not rule out the possibility that the whole can manifest in the parts in a way we can't yet conceive or predict. And so that would be that then spills over into a theological sort of argument that faith is the certainty of things hoped for and the assurance of things unseen. Hebrews 11. Yeah. So there's a sort of certainty which is built into faith, which is true, yes, not necessarily the certainty of syllogistic, apodictic, rational certainty, of course, but it doesn't mean it's not certainty of any kind. Or as Schelling would say, as Schelling says in his essay on freedom, he distinguishes metaphysical and moral necessity.
Jordan, in sympathy with Julian's remarks, and I think David Bentley Hart might have been one of the people that he had in mind that he was talking about.
I agree with that, yeah.
So I actually think that there's a way in which when the emphasis when the universalist argument, when the emphasis becomes too much on the trying to present it in a way that makes it rationally certain, yes, I actually get uncomfortable with that.
Oh yeah, I'm on that. I mean, because here's the thing. We have to interpret what syllogistic certainty itself is.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. Which means we're already beyond it.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, you're bringing in the Kalia Rivet. There we go. All right. Let's. I'm going to remove.
So Julian. I guess I agree with Julian. So yeah.
I'm learning my structure. This is what we're going to do. People will come in. They're allowed to say one thing. then Jordan responds and whomever, and then new people, because otherwise we won't get to other people. Yosef had a great question in here, which we didn't get to, but Yosef, you can say whatever you want.
You have my question because I can't access it.
Do you want to? I'll show it.
Yeah, why don't you show it? Because I wish I could remember exactly how I worded it. Now, I should start. I've never met you before. I am, this little corner is one of the Orthodox Jews in this little corner. So I'm coming with a whole set of different metaphysical assumptions and scripture, obviously.
Nice to meet you.
I've challenged this topic. So I would say for the most part, I'm a near universalist, but we hold out a little bit for free will. And this has always bothered me because this is a very big and important point in the universalism, or whatever you want to call it, hopefully universalism within Kabbalah, where all parts, every part has to be redeemed, not just at the person level, but the sub parts of the person as well. And if that doesn't happen, that's a form of annihilationism, essentially. So here the question is there where's the bounds of the person, right? Like, as I know, Luke likes thinking of persons as fields, but like, at what point do we say, that this is the part we're preserving at this level of resolution, and what parts are, from your perspective, like, those can be annihilated, that I'm comfortable with. Because to me, there's no difference. If you're comfortable with annihilating a single part, you're comfortable with annihilating a person. To me, I don't think there's a real difference there. But I would like to hear if you think maybe there is a difference.
Should I read your question?
You can now, yeah. I mean, I've prefaced it, but you can read it. Yeah.
Let me read it, and then we'll get Jordan's response, and then try to get to chat here. So this is a great question. Is there a meaningful difference between annihilationism and thinking that there are parts of ourself that must be removed/destroyed? And does this imply different degrees within universalism? Those that believe that as long as the destruction is subpersonal, one of their parts, a la IFS, like internal family systems, a pattern within the person or one of their personalities, true false self maybe, those are subject to ultimate annihilation as long as the person himself remains, versus those that believe that universalism implies even reconciliation of these lower parts, that they too must be redeemed, similar to how the Jungian shadow must be integrated, or like that MacDonald quote, right? And if there is a meaningful difference to talking about annihilation at different levels of the person, at what level of personhood does that distinction occur, and why is that level meaningful?
Great question, thank you. I don't think that annihilating a part of a person is necessarily the same thing as annihilating the person, because one of the things about being a person is that you can choose to integrate. Which is to say, you can choose to identify yourself in such a way that it becomes a part of a person, which simultaneously implies that you could disassociate yourself with that same part and still be the one doing it. So your
like a seed dying.
Yeah, I mean, your personhood isn't. I mean, the very fact that the person is more than the sum of the parts is precisely the condition which allows the person to integrate parts or disassociate parts. I mean, so for me, I would say that the spiritual life itself, there's no generic answer. I'm not going to say something like all lower parts will be integrated into the higher synthesis, or, this section or not. It's utterly personal. It's the work of the Spirit in prayer, in your communities of faith, in the liturgies. It's the work of introspection. It's the work of therapy and all this stuff is the work of determining and finding out exactly. It's coming to know yourself so well, which by the fact that you have to come to know yourself means you don't know yourself fully. So how would you know which parts are to be integrated or dissociated without the actual activity of coming to know who you are? And that's what I think spiritual life really is.
So I just want to go back to you. You said something. I missed a lot of it. I'm going to go back and listen. But
Sorry.
The part I came in on, no. Earlier. I missed a lot of the beginning conversation. But the part I came in on that I did hear was about, you talk about Satan. And if Satan, was redeemed, then he wouldn't be Satan anymore. Now that to me doesn't quite match with what you just said, because you're basically saying, well, Satan that's not really who Satan is. Like, if Satan did all this work, but of course, Satan is one. I mean, he's a spiritual being that's kind of this internal kind. But I don't even understand. Someone tried to explain the Catholic metaphysics of this to me at some point, or at least the mainstream position of it. Maybe it was the Thomistic one. I sort of kind of understand it, maybe, but to me, like, it doesn't quite fit what you were just talking about, as far as I can tell.
I think it does, because the core of Satan is Lucifer. So it's not as if I'm saying that like Lucifer becomes in his entirety Satan, such that annihilating Satan would be to annihilate Lucifer. The very dynamic is that the person is, as synthesizing agent, is never even the sum total of whatever parts it's currently integrated, knowingly or not. And so there's also this role of deception there. Lucifer thinks he is Satan, but that's part of being in sinful ignorance. He's not right. He's a liar, even about himself.
But isn't he
And
stuck
yeah,
in that
go ahead.
state?
I don't see why not. Why would he be stuck? What makes him stuck?
Oh, okay. This gets into
Yeah.
This gets into whether angels have free will, and we have big debates over this between us.
Right.
Hey, cue up
okay.
the Jordan Daniel Wood, Yosef Angel conversation. Okay, we're going to go on to Chad. Okay, see you,
Thanks,
Yosef. Thank
Yosef.
you, buddy. Chad. Hi,
What up?
tile dude.
Hi, can you hear me? I probably might lose you. But,
Yes.
so my question is, what's the what would be the ultimate purpose of discussing or trying to have the attention or discussion between universalism and annihilationism, or any teleologic conversation therein? I don't understand why we're so. This conversation seems to be more of an idol than anything. So I'm just curious about that, because I feel like for me, when I try to walk around or walk into universalism, it feels like I'm trying to almost game Christ in some way. And so I'm wondering, what is the ultimate purpose of having the discussion between or tension between universalism and anything else?
Well, I for sure have thoughts, but maybe Jordan, go ahead.
Well, look, I mean, I think we need to sort of disentangle different levels of tension. I mean, if what I am saying, which I'm not, is that if you're not a universalist, you're a heretic, and that you shouldn't consider yourself a Christian or whatever. Okay, well then there's some real, I think there's a real question there.
Yeah.
But look, anytime you do theology, and if God's own goodness plays into it whatsoever, then his own goodness is the reason why you think about the thing that you're thinking. So I happen to think that the universalist position is better, more beautiful, and solicits my faith in God more fully and securely than an annihilationist one, where the God on that picture could call forth from nothing creatures that he supposedly loves infinitely, but also consent to their own self-annihilation to the point where all those who love them would no longer have them to love. I don't see why that's not valuable. What about that is not intrinsically compelling? Maybe it isn't for everybody, and that's fine. I'm not judging, if people don't want to talk about it, it's fine. But I don't think it's that hard to see the difference between whether or not my children could be annihilated, or whether or not I can believe in confidence that we will together enjoy eternal blissful union with God. I mean, could there really be even greater of a difference between them?
Yeah.
The thing that's interesting, because what Chad was saying, kind of almost reminds me a little bit of the kind of some of the early church attitude where during the history of the early church, when universalism was more widely spread, a lot of universalists were held to universalism, but believed that it was irresponsible to teach the doctrine publicly. So there's a little bit of the sense of that in what Chad is saying. Yeah. And I think, the thing is that we've had doctrinal development in the history of the church. Originally, the church was more universalist than not, while simultaneously having this idea that universalism should be kind of a secret kept by the most intelligent and educated of Christians, and maybe kept a secret from the general public. And then, beginning in the 4th century, some form of infernalism becomes more dominant, and early on, the form of infernalism that was most widely believed was eternal conscious torment. Like, that was the default, like, mainstream position for a good chunk of Christian history. But since that time, all of the doctrinal development has been going away from that. And now universalism is starting to pick up steam. And this time, as universalism is picking up steam, we don't share that sensibility of it being irresponsible to proclaim it. Because because I think fundamentally we have a different view of human nature than they did then.
Okay, can I add to that quick? And then Jordan, you obviously have something to say. And then we're going to go to Dave. And then here we go. Last call. If you want a question, get in here, because we might just close it out with Dave. Be bold. Be bold, and reality will rise up and meet you, right? Isn't that some quote? But yeah, that's right. I'm so quotable. Nate, I do agree with you, because here's the problem too we've said this a lot of times, that there are utilitarian implications for all the different perspectives, like teaching from the pulpit. And if you're a priest or a pastor or whatever, infernalism, I know a lot of atheists who are atheists because of the doctrine of eternal conscious torment. And so there are ramifications on all sides. And our kind of universalist is not a like you get away with stuff thing.
Can I say something really, really quick, Luke?
Yeah.
It's actually related to the whole Rod Dreher thing that kind of started. That was kind of the seed that launched us even doing this at all. And Rod had that very knee-jerk reaction of like, somehow if infernalism isn't true, he doesn't understand why anybody would be a Christian. That is so alien to me that I just don't like. It's one of the few, I do not like arguing about this in public. And it's one of the few things that someone can say that will get a reaction, because I'm precisely the opposite. I had to believe, I was always a universalist and had to come to believe that it was possible to be a universalist and a Christian in order to be a Christian at all. So entirely the opposite. Now, I think both you, Jordan and Luke, I think you're a little bit more of the type who, like, at one time you did.
Well, I grew up
believe
believing the Bible, Nate, so I was
right.
Yeah. I mean, most of my, I guess I can still say that. Yeah, most of my life I was infernalist straight up, and I didn't even see the appeal to universalism, and I didn't even think there was an exegetical argument to be had. I mean, yeah, I just I have an essay that I wrote when I was 21 called "Why Hell is Fuller Than Heaven."
Amen, brother.
So I keep it in my computer so that I can try to drum up some empathy, because I was also that way. But I mean, yeah, a few points on on what you said just now, Nate, and then I'll work back to what you said about the early church and stuff. So, I mean, if we need evil or threats or fear, which I thought perfect love cast out, in order to be drawn to God, then God needs aids outside of himself to accomplish what he himself cannot do. He is insufficient to draw us to him. He is incapable of holding us to him. He is utterly and completely incapacitated to allure us or to interest us in any kind of lasting eternal way. And this is why, with all my disagreements with St. Augustine, I at least think he was right about this. If God is standing helpless at the end, looking at the end result and saying, God, I wish, I guess to himself, God, I wish this had happened differently. Then look, that's a pathetic God. And that God who chose to undertake a project that he wasn't even confident he could pull off, which good for God, I guess he doesn't have to suffer eternally, but lots of other people do because of his incapacity. I'm sorry. I mean, that's I don't really know the difference anymore between that sort of God personally. Now, I get it. I was also, once upon a time, I would have been saying, well, God is sovereign. We don't know his ways and so forth. But yeah, so I can't accept that view one way or the other. I think almost it makes more logical sense, even if morally I'm still pretty repelled. It makes more logical sense, at least, to say, just go ahead and say God willed the end result, even if that is the massa damnata. That's what Augustine would say. And so, so there's that point. Now, just quickly, another point, and we'll get to Michael, but another point about early Christian reticence and prudence around the topic. That is a little selective, right? Because it's Gregory of Nyssa says this in his catechetical homilies to new Christians. He even says that the devil himself will be saved. I know there's been some dispute there, but I think the exegetical arguments are horrible, actually. And so does Brian Daly, for what it's worth. And so, that was selective. And what I do think is this is sort of an unprovable conviction. I realize that. But look, we've got a lot of obstacles to faith nowadays. I'm not sure if I'm the only one that senses that, but there's a lot of baggage to Christian history, to the various branches of the church, to all of the things in which it's engaged. And it is harder for my students, 18 to 22-year-old here, to have some obvious, immediate, transparent, fervent faith than it has ever been, I think. And so I do think one of the things, the conviction I have, is that one of the reasons why bringing this out more explicitly makes sense in this time, in this place, is precisely because we're kind of at the point where we don't have these external aids to hold us to faith. We might actually need nothing but the beauty, the sheer goodness, the God who is light in order to do that. And if somebody says, well, we really need fear and hell and all these things. Now, granted, I'm a universalist. I think there will be judgment. There is in that sense fear. It will be painful, et cetera, et cetera. So it's not a magic trick thing. But if you think that alone is going to secure faith in Christ, why don't you take a look at Europe? How did that go? Post-Christian world, what happened? Look at the Sistine Chapel. There's plenty of fear there. Did it work? So I don't buy it.
All right, Michael.
Okay, so my question is, and I don't really have any problem with. I'm not some hell advocate or whatever, but on a practical level, assuming a universalist outcome in the ultimate sense, what do you think we should do about the distinctions that, like, Paul makes about the elect, versus those who are not of the elect? And because I think obviously there's maybe behavioral and pastoral problems to how much you emphasize like an assurance of salvation or an insecurity of salvation, of shifting that around and saying, an assurance of being elect. Like what is the distinction there, and how should we proceed? Because I think that's the question, is that everybody says, like, if you believe in what Rod Dreher's critique is, if you just tell everybody that they're saved, at least in their rebellious teenage years, they're just going to go off the rails and do whatever, something. So what is Paul telling us to do with that kind of election language when we read like the book of Romans?
But why do we assume that people? I'm sorry, I had to answer this.
I'm assuming that's not my assumption.
Right.
That's the
Right.
assumption of Assemblies of God youth pastors.
I get it. But as someone who never believed in hell, not for one moment of my life, I did not live a life of like just doing whatever I wanted and building broken relationships and not caring about people.
I used to be really holy when I affirmed eternal conscious torment. I did everything I was supposed to, and now it is terrible. The stuff I do now that I know I can get away with it is just unbelievable.
Well, look, I mean, at some point, this argument would become an argument against grace itself. should I sin so that grace may abound all the more? I mean, that's also in Romans. So the idea would be, right?
Absolutely not.
You've been liberated. All the terrible things you've done. Hey, I've heard this before as an objection to Christianity, pure and simple. So are you saying that so-and-so, the worst person in the world, can just repent on their deathbed and they're saved? Whereas somebody who's just a decent, hardworking person but never believed in Christ can go to hell? Is that fair? Right?
That whole 11th hour thing.
You
man.
know, yeah. So it's like, look, I mean, if the motivation is something other than the sheer joy and infinite satisfaction of God himself, then I don't think anything is better or worse. Different things will work for different people, right? But you know, I think perfect love casts out fear because it doesn't need fear when it's perfected, right?
All right, Michael, we have too many people. I'm sorry. This is
Okay.
me at my most structured. We just gotta say goodbye. I
He's
love
turned a
you,
button.
buddy.
Thank you, Michael. It's good to see you again, my friend.
All right, we're going to Dave, and then I told Nate in the thing privately. Dave is allowed to do no screen because I vetted him. He's a friend. It's
Yeah,
fine.
we know-
I
we
know
know
he's not
Dave
going to show a caged penis.
Yeah, I don't know if you can hear me yet. But
Gotcha.
We can hear you, Dave.
You
We
can
can
hear
you,
me.
Dave.
Okay, all right. Yeah,
Yes.
I don't usually do anything publicly. I'm only
Yeah. Can I just say something about you really quick?
Yeah,
He's
sure.
wonderful.
Okay. So Dave is the guy who is Dave's a wonderful, like, Orthodox Christian guy. He's always the guy who, like, after I say something totally crazy, like, comes to me and says, actually the strange thing you said, this is the Orthodox saint that said it. This is where they said it.
It is
Perfect.
true. Nate is like an intuitively Orthodox dude. But yeah, okay. So all right. So this isn't in any way hostile. I think you guys know that I'm, which way I kind of lean. But I have this statement, and I wrote it in the chat. So I'll just read it. And it's this: when every soul says, all others will be saved, and I alone will be condemned, then paradoxically all will be saved. And that's what I always say when someone asks me if I'm a universalist or not. And the reason I say that is I believe that all great truths are expressed in paradox. And so I guess my question here is an absolute position either way on universalism, does it eschew paradox in favor of argumentation? And that's it,
Yeah.
basically.
Oh, thank you, Dave. I think there are versions of it that do, for sure. I think if it becomes just like almost any topic, though, I mean, it becomes a game of sort of analytic, dialectical, who's better, who outperforms the other person. This is just a perennial temptation on any important topic that's ever existed. But I actually think it's a different kind of rationalism to absolutize paradox as suspending two contradictory positions. Because what that does is it basically takes our current state of dialectical, slow, discursive reasoning and says, this is the only thing that sort of draws the final limits. So paradoxically, I think sometimes when people sort of get worried about argumentation, what they're really doing is just masking over their own very definite argument, which is that we could never know such a thing. But that's no less a claim, and it's no less one made by a reasonable person as anything. So sure. I don't think anyone's avoiding synthesis or making absolute claims. It's just what you're absolutizing is the question.
Yeah. Okay. So I guess the other thing would be like, perhaps we have to deal in paradox in this world, but we won't have to in the next.
Yeah.
I don't know.
I also think the question is, so I agree with you. I don't think anyone avoids paradox. The question is, where do you put it and why?
Okay.
The universalist puts it on the process.
Mm-hmm.
I do not know how certain people, I don't know how I myself can be saved. Who will save me from this body of death? I can't see a way out. This is the stuff of the spiritual life. This is why I need, mentors. This is why I need prayer. This is why I need the great rich spiritual traditions, is because I'm figuring that out. There's no abstract answer to that. I have to work through all of that. But I don't put the mystery on the final outcome, precisely because, in my opinion, it's a direct expression of God himself. But I think thinking eschatologically never requires that. Do you affirm the general resurrection from the dead?
Yes.
Well, how will that happen?
I don't know.
Exactly, right? So we already see that we can be paradoxical or unsure or suspending judgment about process, but that does not lead to being similarly coy about product or end.
Okay. Yeah, that's really helpful, actually. That's very helpful. So I won't take up any more time.
Thanks, Dave.
Unless somebody else has something to say. Yeah.
It's good to have you on the stream, Dave.
All right. Thanks.
Thanks, Dave.
Yeah.
We'll move on to Mitch. Mitchell, are you working?
Yeah, trying and listening to you guys. It's good listening to you guys. Dave really kind of, I think, has something pretty similar to what I was going to say. I'll say it in the way that I was going to say it, and you can see if there's any more there. The way I was thinking about it, and I'm not a Christian Universalist. I'm not a Universalist, Luke knows. When you sum up Christian Universalism in a sentence or two, could you also say a sentence or two that was true, that you believe, that seemed totally contradicted? You know, I don't have any problem saying God loves everyone, or if you reject God, you'll go to hell forever. And if you can do something like that too, why not just say, I guess, all the true things? Is there danger in kind of making this into a hobby horse?
Because it's about actual people. And love is always about actual people. I don't see it as a hobby horse.
Actually, I want to address that because I want to explain why I've never believed in a hell of the kind that infernalists advocate. Obviously, as we've talked about earlier here, I do believe in hell in some sense, but it's in a different sense. Now, the reason I never believed it is because I was told when I was very young that my grandfather, who was the person I most loved in the whole world and who I really enjoyed spending time with, my parents when I was young were like, they were like standard, like they're kind of like evangelical Christians who like came out of the Jesus movement in the late 60s and the early 70s. And they told me that my grandfather, who was the best man I knew, would go to hell because he did not believe in the way that they thought one had to believe in order to be, quote, saved, unquote. And I knew the whole thing was bullshit from that moment. Like, that's just like, oh, okay. Obviously, everything you guys believe is complete horseshit if you actually think that. Because I had enough moral intuition to know that my grandfather, who I loved, was a very good man. And any God that would choose to send to eternal perdition a person who I knew and loved and knew to be good was not a God that I could ever get behind. But I never didn't believe in God in some sense. I just didn't believe in that God. And so it took a long time for me to realize that the God I believed in, even then, when I was 5 years old, is actually the God that is revealed in the Bible.
Could you say something like, God would never send my grandfather to hell? He would never do it. Could you say that and also say, if you reject God, you will go to hell forever?
But then you have to add this
for an unending duration of time without possibility of repentance. Is that what you mean by hell?
I mean, forever and hell.
Right. And then you have to add a third thing. And God created his grandfather knowing full well that's exactly where he would end up. That's what I don't accept.
The moral monster.
Well, the moral monster is that we can deconstruct everything, but that doesn't mean we should stop saying things.
I think I've been saying a lot. I don't really see me not saying something. What I'm saying is you're not saying enough, which is you just said these two things could be held together. God loves my grandfather, and he could reject forever and go to hell. But you
You
didn't
don't-
say a third thing, which is that God knows that he will end up in hell forever. And I'm sorry, you can't get God
Because
off
you
the hook
don't need
unless
to say that. You don't need to say that.
Well, I do.
You don't
I
always
do,
have
for
to
love.
put yourself into a theological corner like that, where you have to have
Hey, Mitch,
limitations to your.
Hey, Mitch, is there any line for you that God couldn't do?
It would be very easy to get me to deconstruct God's behavior
Mitch,
and what
Mitch,
he could or couldn't do.
Mitch, can God command that somebody be raped?
You have to have operative limitations to your theology. No, I would never say that about God.
Why? Why can't you just say two things? He still loves them.
So you would say, I think I see what you're getting at, that the operative limitation to your theology is that you would never say something like, if you reject God, you go to hell forever.
Yeah, exactly. And what I'm saying is that everybody has those limits, not just universalists.
Well, and right. And I think also both Jordan and I both assume that although we may not to be able to have like a rational intellectual certainty about things, that we have to believe that reality, and ultimately when we're talking about reality, we are talking about God, because the author is the foundation and author of everything that is real. Then it has to be intelligible, or you're really like Mark earlier. It's like you're really just a nihilist. So don't.
Yeah.
And I'm sorry, my Calvinist friends, but the Calvinist version of God leads directly to nihilism, because you essentially are saying, because we can't know the good at all, that reality is unintelligible.
Yeah, I think
Okay.
there's a.
Well, Mitch. Yeah, Mitch. We're gonna move on to Chezi. Sorry, buddy. Continue it more later.
Nate, I'll also say, just while we're waiting for somebody else to come on, don't you think though that certain forms of Calvinism are still rationalist?
Yes, for sure. They're very rationalists.
Yeah,
Yes.
they're just rationalists in theology in a primarily negative way. Like there's a very definite view
But they
of
do
God,
always have that
right?
fail-safe, though. They always do have that fail-safe because they believe that the reason has fallen. And that fail-safe of theirs, as far as I'm concerned.
But they know that through their fallen
reason.
I mean,
Yes.
I
mean,
whenever you absolutize these things, it's the Ouroboros. All right, Chezi, what up, buddy? Yep, you're muted, my friend. And while you unmute, I'm going to say excellent jacket.
Thank God. And
As he always is so stylish.
praise the Lord. Thank you all for putting in the time and into this. These things are great. I'll be short.
Oh no.
Oh no. You went dark in all the ways. That was short. You were short. Amen. Shoot.
Oh, no.
Well, Chezi, if you can come back. Okay, let's do some. Jordan, I would like to ask you. Oh,
he's back. He's back.
Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, we can hear you.
Hello?
Yep.
Yeah, gotcha.
Yes. You can hear me? Okay.
Yes.
I can't hear myself, but I'll just trust that I'm making sense. There's a lot of the conversation over here with regards to the universalism. Obviously, in a Jewish perspective, right, this all is under the rubric of the Noahides, right? Everyone over here is already has a place in the world to come, because as far as we're concerned, we're all God-fearers, and you're all already participating in what God is expecting from the world in a certain sense. However, in Judaism, obviously there is, and in the Old Testament, there's definitely a discussion with regards to what's going to happen if we don't pay attention, if we don't listen, if we don't follow the proper orientation. And those are quite intense verses. I would say, though, that there are two great sages that one which is ultra-Orthodox, which would be like to one extreme, and one would be more modern Orthodox, who both came out saying that originally a lot of these decrees, a lot of these verses, and a lot of these warnings are really here to put us in the straight and narrow, more as a warning, more as a guide to make sure someone is in proper orientation. However, at this point, when we see that that no longer moves the people to get closer to God, there's no point of using that kind of language anymore because it's no longer effective. And we have to realize, both as participants now in our respective religions, but even back then, that the relationship, while we're still connected to the same core, the relationship matures. I mention this often, how God tells Moses that, he is presenting himself to Moses in the burning bush as I am becoming as I am becoming. But to Abraham, I introduce myself as El Shaddai. And as we progress and as we get to learn more about God, we also could peel off some layers which are no longer necessary. So talking about eternal damnation and things like that, I don't think that language is relevant for us anymore. Is it true that people could be damned? Yes. Are there consequences to bad decisions? Yes. Ultimately, God will rectify all. And our prophets tell us this, that redemption is in a blink of an eye. We could prolong the process. It eventually will come. So it is up to us to obviously hasten this and bring the Messiah quicker. And that has to do with us rectifying the world properly. But as individuals, we all eventually, I believe, will be redeemed. There are again levels to these things and questions to even in one's redemption. The more one has allowed himself to be purified, presumably that is a vessel that will be able to contain more of God's glory in the end of days. Obviously, these are all loaded terms, but I believe everyone gets redeemed. And we have to realize in today's day and age, when we're on a quest to bring everyone closer towards recognizing God, that language of hell and damnation is just no longer necessary. Those were my thoughts that I wanted to add. I wanted to know if you guys had any thoughts on that.
No, I think that I don't have a problem with any of that. So
yeah, I mean, I think it's just
go ahead.
I think it's I agree with that too. I just think that it's funny because he is seeing, I think, the heart of what's going on here, which is, I would just say, perfect love casts out fear, and that's where everything's going.
Yes.
And on the other hand, from the other side, people are like, "Well, you guys are all libertines, like you think nothing matters since everything's wrapped up in a bow at the end, and so where's the process? Where's the sincerity of having to do with judgment and all that, right?" And I just think, if you've raised kids, you already know the answers, and you already know that those are not two different things, or they're not contradictory, right? I can warn very sternly my kids not to do X, Y, and Z. Because either I will, enforce a consequence or natural consequences. Either way, they're going to feel some sort of pain or suffering, and also hope that they get to a point in maturation, as he was saying, where they don't need that anymore.
Right. There's a way in which the way he was talking about like us being responsible for the acceleration of the coming of the Messiah. I think that way about the parousia. Like there's a way in which it's the parousia hasn't arrived because of us. Like there's there's a role for us to play in the parousia. And so I think that even though he's coming at it from a Jewish perspective, in terms of the way that he thinks about Messiah, there's a strong alignment there with me.
Right, exactly. And from the Christian side, it would be that the incarnation has so effected a solidarity between God and the world,
right?
That Paul can even call our future resurrections, quote, outgrowths of his own,
right?
And so I agree.
Hey, Michael, welcome back.
Okay, I wanted to take a second crack at this because you totally side railed the question I was trying to ask Nate. Even though I love you, I don't want because we always go the negative way. So that's not what I'm interested in. So my interest in the thing about like election, and I'll even use like Israel as the example. Because as we know, there's like a lot of way heightened anti-Semitism and things like that. So for a virtuous person, someone who loves their children and loves their neighbor and all these things, they're not living in fear of hell. But why then would they choose to like identify themselves with Israel or whatever. Like, why would you put yourself in that position? Like, and I mean, I understand it because when you encounter God, there's nothing he can't ask of you, essentially. But like, if you're going to evangelize your neighbors, how do you tell them, like, you should come near this thing that can totally upend your life, and maybe not in a positive way when you're trying to pitch it to your neighbors.
So is the question, like, why would you believe in God if you're a universalist, given that belief in God or being a part of the people of God might bring on suffering?
Well, I'm just saying more so, like, what is the, like, it's interesting because it's like I do come from, so like my father comes into the faith because he has encounters with demons, and he's experiences things on drugs and things like that, and so it's like Jesus is the freedom from the bondage of sin, and then I grow up serving God and realizing, like, well, he brought my parents together for a purpose. I didn't have to go through all that. I do have my own, reconciliation and repentance and all that thing. But it's like, hey, my life would be a lot easier if I wasn't called by God to be involved in the ministry and involved in, the body of Christ. Like, my convictions don't just let me chill out on Sundays or whatever, So
yeah.
So
I mean,
what is...
I hope that you also think that your belief in God delivers you joys and delights that you wouldn't otherwise have.
Oh yeah, for sure. But I just
so those are the
know
reasons.
But,
so those are the reasons. I mean, like, it's like I don't know. To me, that's just such a different way to frame it. I don't really relate to it because it's like, it would be like asking, why would you get married and love your wife if that's going to entail all of these travails, and you grow old together, you got to take care of each other, you have kids, and that's all obviously very annoying sometimes. There's a lot of work, and my life in a sense would be easier if I just was like a bachelor, or I went off and sort of didn't have all these responsibilities. But the answer to that is not, well, I should believe that if I don't do these responsibilities, that I will suffer something even greater. The answer to that is, it's worth it. That's the answer. The answer is, you take on the responsibilities not just to be a responsibility taker honor. you take them on because what you will get out of that, the profundity and the delight of true love, is itself its own absolute justification that needs no further reason.
Okay, so just to say, how do you evangelize your neighbors? What do you tell them about Christ to spark that joy?
I say, taste and see that the Lord is good, and whatever you think is good isn't, and will not give you the satisfaction that only God will. I mean, I don't know what else there is to say. It's why doesn't Paul ever talk about hell in any of his letters if it's so important to the gospel message?
Well, I mean, I'm like, so just to give context, like, I mean, I'm totally on board with everything you're saying, like, because and this is me, like, I grew up, I didn't learn people thought you could, like, lose your salvation until I was a teenager, and then I was like, wow, this is scary, and I saw, like, how that, I would say there's a lot of behavior management that gets, that's a reason for a lot of doctrine or whatever. And ultimately, I don't think that's good, because the fruit that you get from it, it may spring up quickly in the immediate term, but it doesn't have those roots. Yeah. So, so I mean, you don't have to give the answer now. I wrote a book wrestling with these things, but like, I mean, it seems like, is there a mode or whatever that the church should be, like, operating in that I don't know, repairs the work of the kingdom in the world, like, or what, maybe like a direction. You think, what's like the direction that maybe people who aren't all the way on board, like, what's the nudge that we give, I don't know, normie Christians or whatever? Yeah,
I mean, I think it is just I don't know. Like, it's interesting. It's like whenever I've had like in-depth conversations with people about this, they see the inherent beauty of the vision itself and they're compelled by it. Like they don't need anything else. And I've had lots of people, despite maybe some of the comments in the chats here, but there's been lots of other people that have written me messages in all kinds of forums saying that now I can maybe be a Christian again. Perhaps now I actually know what good news is. Now I have a new vitality to my prayer life I've never had before. And I get it. When we're like talking on here, people don't say, all they see is cerebral stuff. I mean, that's fine. That's a judgment you're making more or less in ignorance, as you don't have any idea where this came from. But there's not you, by the way, Michael, but I just mean other people. But yeah, I just think it's, God is light, and in him there's no darkness at all. And he will draw all humans to himself when he is raised up. And that the sort of love that God is will be the only and final justification for loving God. And if it's anything else, then I guess either God alone is not sufficient to convert everyone, or else he's not satisfactory for us and he won't fulfill us. And I don't believe those things. So I guess in that sense, I just go back to the more original sense of witness. Look, what could be better, right? That kind of appeal, right? And so in my experience, not with everybody, of course, but in my experience, that actually is extremely practical to people. Yeah, I don't know. I'm not sure if that really goes towards what you're saying. I mean, this is like, to me, it's inherent. This is inherent in the articulation of this conversation around these themes and topics. It's not just to like show, oh, look how intellectual I am or whatever. For me, it's always been fundamentally existential.
It's not an intellectual thing for me at all. It's
Paul in Romans 9-11 agonizing over what he seems to think initially. I mean, he might not have thought this, but what he sees can appear as God's unfaithfulness, which is to say, then he can't be trusted, or you can't put your faith in him because he isn't reliable. Right, in the view of the situation he's dealing with there, and of course where he ends, as we know, is Romans 11, 32, which is I think universalist. And so the very process of him wrestling through what then is God, is he unfaithful? Is he reliable? Has he cast off his people forever? No, actually, he's working out. In fact, that draws other people, and then when they're drawn, it sort of motivates these people. And this whole thing is God pulling all these guys together, all humanity together, using their very rebellion in order to convert others and so forth, right? And then that's why in the end, all Israel shall be saved, right? And God consigns all over to disobedience so that he might pour forth mercy upon all. Like, that's to me the sort of dynamism of this conversation, as it leads to that kind of conclusion. And that vision is itself a final sort of compelling motive for faith.
I think, Michael, thank you. Cal's been waiting for a while, so I'm going to go ahead and
Adios.
take you off stage.
Thanks,
and
Michael.
Cal in. Cal, can you hear us? Hey,
Oh,
Man, I am so nervous. Yes, can you hear me?
yeah.
yes.
Can you hear me? Okay.
Yep.
I'm really nervous to talk to you because we've spoken before, but I read your book and on Christology and Maximus. I don't know how good my connection is either, so apologies if it's not good. I'm one of the JDW super fans, which you may not have known exists, but we're out here. So
All two of you.
I'm a recent convert to I'm a recent convert to Catholicism, like November of 2 years ago now. One thing I'm wondering is if you can be a universalist and also affirm eternal conscious torment. Now, to explain myself a little bit more, I have to get into some intuitions that I don't share with everybody else. I think I used to share them, but the more I thought about it, the less it made sense to me. Like when people say damnation is going to last for all eternity, the idea that it goes for all eternity sounds as strange to me now, or as incoherent or empty to me now, as if one said, go find the last number of an infinite series and count to it. Or go sum an infinite series. Like any interval that you can take all of is implicitly a finite interval. Because if you're saying it's endless, it's as if you said, yeah, we looked at all of it and we saw there was no end to it. Well, if you looked at all of it, then there was an end to it. So to me, there's a more sensitive metaphysics, which is actually weirdly closer to what the Bible's usage of olam and aionios seems to be, because those eternal processes come to an end quite often. We think as moderns we're smarter and more sophisticated, but I think the ancients had a more sensitive kind of existential or process, if you will, even process theistic way of understanding eternity, which is it's something that is defined up to a horizon, but beyond the horizon it is undefined, either X or not X, or neither X nor not X, and you don't know. So in other words, an indefinite process. An eternal process is an indefinite process, and an indefinite process is one which is always free to either continue or to stop. Now, of course, that to me that seems the more sensitive metaphysics. But now, of course, Augustine said in his treatment of Matthew 25. But see, now watch out for the all eternity thing, because people keeps making sense to them until they think about it more, and people really think they mean something when they think that. But I just thought about it so much that it stopped being able to mean something to me. And so I tend to think this is a possible experience for other people to have, but I could just be wrong about all of this. But Augustine, said in his treatment of Matthew 25:46, the sheep go on to eternal life, the goats go on to eternal punishment. Unless we can say eternity means the same thing for both of these, groups, then we can't say that heaven is eternal in any full or meaningful sense. What if heaven could suddenly stop? But if one has a theological principle, say, this is just one way I can think to distinguish them, even allowing them to both be eternal in the sense of indefinite. Which even that concept itself, any concept of infinity, if you ask me, it's like it's always the slippery sort of self-negating concept. That's why, like you, I have some level of respect for Hegel, because he seemed to understand these dynamics quite well. But one difference I can note between the eternity of the sheep and the eternity of the goats is that God may have an interest in prolonging one and not prolonging the other, because one is his permissive will. Death is not what he desires as an end in itself. And it has to be understood as death, or the negation of identity on some deep level, even if we're not annihilationists. And life is an end in itself. And so one is his permissive will, one is his positive will. So one question that I think, if Catholic theology maybe ever got to this point, maybe if the discourse someday developed to the point where people were asking, like, in principle, could God end hell if he wanted, or could he bring it to a close? Is God himself unable to bring hell to an end? To me, that might possibly be an illuminating question, although one kind of answer to that I can think off right at the top of my head is that God is perfectly just by nature, and it is just for them. It is just for him never to bring hell to an end. Therefore, he wouldn't ever do that. It's not compatible with his nature to do that. So, in principle, even God couldn't. But there's even more I can say about this as far as my ways of squaring it, and for me it becomes hopeful universalism. But I just want to hear your thoughts, I guess, on sort of to the extent to which we can actually affirm eternal eternal hell as universalists.
I just wanted, before Jordan answers, just a really quick observation. There's actually an alarming similarity in your mode of thinking here and what Tomberg writes in letter 8 of Meditations on the Tarot. I would recommend it to you. Just even if you just read letter 8 and see the way he deals with that, he actually specifically objects to a notion of eternity that ties it to quantity, and says that that's where we go wrong. And then he actually has this beautiful passage where he talks about the way in which Gethsemane actually defeats eternal hell. So,
yeah, thank you, Cal. That's great. So it's very easy to overlook, as you're indicating, that aeonios and even eternus in Latin and all these other cognates really are relative terms. That is to say, they're mostly negative terms. They are that time or age or realm or whatever that is not this one, right? So they're always spoken from a perspective. And that goes really nicely with what you're saying, is because, as it were, from the inside, something can look like it has no edges or no ends, but that the judgment primarily stops in a negative one. It's just indefinite, undefined for me. I don't see it, right? And not only, I got this passage handy because I thought maybe it would be useful. Origen points out something not quite as mathematical as you did, but he points out the different senses and types of eternity in his commentary on Romans, book 5, section 8. Here's what he writes. Very different from Augustine, by the way. Nevertheless, no matter how much a person may continue in sin, no matter how much he should hold out under the dominion and authority of death, I do not think the kingdom of death is therefore of eternal duration in the same way as that of life and righteousness, especially when I hear from the apostle that the last enemy, death, is going to be destroyed. And in fact, if the duration of the eternity of death is supposed to be the same as that of life, death will no longer be its contrary to life, but instead its equal. For an eternal will not be contrary to an eternal, but identical. Now it's certain that death is contrary to life. Therefore, it is certain that if life is eternal, death cannot be eternal. Whence also the resurrection of the dead necessarily takes place. And he goes on, talks about the nature of the resurrection. But see, he's making a similar point, which is that, and this is kind of how I think of Augustine in his interpretation of Matthew 25, is it's just a sort of univocal, first of all, it's a univocal fixation on the adjective eternal punishment, eternal life. And you fix a univocal meaning, and then you identify them wholly apart from the noun that they are qualifying. Right? But the thing is, and it's sort of like I think pretty simplistic way of thinking about grammar, is that we think, oh, the adjective is a thing that always modifies. But it's also true that the noun it modifies can in turn modify it. I have a terrible joy when I see this, or this is awfully great, but also I have an awful headache. Right? So awful means two different things because of what it modifies. So it itself is modified. And what Origen's noting is, if the life which is eternal that we get through Christ is nothing less than God's eternity, then the quality of God's eternity cannot be the thing that eternal death or eternal perdition or whatever means whenever it's used in conjunction with that noun. Unless you want to make, as he says, death equal, not just the contrary, but equal to life. Now, the metaphysic there, right, is a little bit, I mean, he's assuming that a contrary is like a privative contrary, right?
Right.
Which is to say, he's assuming God is life, as Scripture also says, God is life, and God is light. And anything that's not that, because God is primary, Alpha and Omega, will simply be the deprivation of what he is eternally and completely and infinitely. And so that is an assumption there. It's one I would agree with. And so I think his argument holds. But I would say that Eriugena also has a discussion of the various senses of eternity. The Catholic theologian Trent Pomplin has also indicated that the Latin uses of aevum, eternus, and all that throughout the Middle Ages very remarkably. Also with this sensibility of the relative, like something could be eternal in relation to something lower in it, but then in a sense, a different set of finitude, a different finite set in relation to what's above it or something like that. Right. And so, yeah, I mean, all that's just is just to agree with you. And I do think that's one way to, as Catholics, you and I, we are forced to think through this, I think, a little bit more rigorously, because there are things we have to take into account as Catholics. And even though I get more or less written off by certain people as a heretic or excluded from the Catholic Church, even though I'm not, I still do give deference to those things, and I have to incorporate them into my version of universalism, right? And my very attempt to do that, I would hope, would be enough to show my good faith in trying to be as faithful to the church as I can be. But also, I'm faithful to a church that has clearly developed on this very topic towards my very position. And so I'm not just faithful to the church, static, frozen in my favorite time of the church or age of the church. I'm faithful to the church, which is a living body of Christ, and that's what I'm trying to do.
I just want to share the actual, at least the Gethsemane part of the passage from Tomberg, another Catholic, and Tomberg in this letter, he affirms both the restoration of all things and eternal hell, and this is contemplating the meaning of eternity is the way that he does that. He says this. He says the anguish of Gethsemane, which gave rise to the perspiration of blood, was eternal. This night, the night of Gethsemane, was not measured in hours. It is immeasurable, therefore eternal. It is due to its eternity that he sweated blood, and not because of the temporary and therefore passing trial. He knew eternal hell through experience. And as he came out of it, we have the good news that not only death is vanquished by resurrection, but that also that hell is through Gethsemane. The majesty of the victory over hell, announced by the words, "I am he," caused many to prostrate themselves on the ground from amongst the band of soldiers and officers, from the chief priests and the Pharisees who had come to arrest him. The soul of Origen was also prostrated in the face of the victory over eternal hell, and moved by the revelation contained in the words, it is I, spoken by he who had just come out from eternal hell. This is why Origen himself knew with certain knowledge that there would be no damned at the end of the world, and that the devil also would be saved. And whoever meditates on the sweat and blood in Gethsemane, and on the words, "It is I," or "I am he," announcing the eternal victory over eternal hell, will know with certain knowledge that eternal hell exists as a reality, but that it will be empty at the end of time. The sweat of blood in Gethsemane is the source of Origenism. Here is the source of its inspiration.
Wow, that's great.
Yeah.
Is there another question behind me, or do I have time to respond?
You can respond, and then we'll let Matt's lurking, but we'll let you respond.
This is fascinating, because what it's all getting to is the kind of the central mystery that we have to contend with by holding two things in tension. One is like the reality of process, and the other is the reality of God's foreknowledge. It is as if God has seen all eternity. He has divided by zero. He has completed the never-ending process in what he knows. But no one can really imagine what that involves. But somehow we're required to hold both of these two things in tension. What I noted from the Tomberg thing was the immeasurability of Gethsemane, and the way that the present moment is by its nature immeasurable. You can't measure the present except by what it isn't, namely the past. And so there's a way that every moment, every now, sort of is now until it isn't. And when it's over, it's seen in I like to put it like this.
You have to read it, because that actually matches what he says. That actually matches what he says a few paragraphs before, as he's establishing that, as he's going into the argument. So, yes.
See, Suppose suppose the present is a superposition which, when it ends, is seen in retrospect never to have been a superposition. You can go into the condition of indefinite suffering, and when it ends, if it ends, you see you were never in hell. But when you were there, when you were in it, it was hell. So
Well-
there's something here that the actual is carving it at the joints, the existential tension between two perspectives, a classical theism perspective and a process theism perspective.
And the key, I think, would be that the transition from the indeterminate superposition to a position cannot itself be plotted according to the measurement proper to either.
All right, Kyle, we're going to get Matt in here.
My
now.
connection broke up. I'm going to have to listen to that again when I get off and re-listen to this. I'm going to make room for the next question. Thank
Good
you.
to see you, Kyle.
Both of you.
Yep. Hey, Matt.
Hey, thanks. Is my audio okay? Is that
Yeah,
Perfect.
I can hear you.
Wonderful. I'm very nervous to be here. JD, honestly, I have no idea who you are.
Good.
I'm very nervous to talk to Nate, and the people in this corner there's a lot of Gandalfs of Universalism over here. And so I know I'm going to do a terrible job of asking any kind of question, but you seem like a very nice guy. You seem very smart. So I'm very much looking forward
I'm
to
not.
that.
Yeah.
Probably going to flatten me out in seconds. But my understanding of, okay, I'm trying to understand what Jesus did in his earthly life, his death, his untimely murder. Why was he lynched and murdered? Why did he experience hell in Gethsemane? And I hear that he took on our humanity. But I also hear that he does not take on, and this seems very important, and please correct me on any line of this, because I'll land the plane quickly. But I hear that he does not take on our sin. That's something we have to pay in purgatory. So I don't see how he experiences hell if it's not on our behalf, and I don't understand how he takes on our humanity if he doesn't take on our sin. Because we have to pay the full price in the hereafter. So that's where I'm at, and I welcome any feedback or correction.
I mean, I think he only experiences hell because we create it. So it's not like that. In fact, I would say it's the solidarity. It's the very fact that in the incarnation, he so binds himself, to quote Romans 8, to the likeness of sinful flesh. But he himself is not sinful. So his very body is already, as it were, affected and shaped, and therefore is a response to our sin. So the form in which he comes, the way he's born, what he does whenever he's ministering in the Gospels, what he says, what he teaches, how he dies, how he descends to Hades and hell, how he's resurrected from the grave, how he ascends and is waiting for the 1 Corinthians 15:28 to occur. All of those things are both initiative of our salvation, so that he's the pioneer and author of our salvation, but also is responsive to our failure, our sin. And he's doing all of that at the same time, which certainly does make it, sort of confusing, or like something we have to sort of parse through. But I think, nevertheless, I couldn't really imagine more of a soteriology that says we don't pay for anything on our own, because he is always there enabling us, even in hell. He's enabling us by his grace to be redeemed and sanctified. That's why he's there.
Okay, but there's no substitutionary atonement, obviously, in this scenario.
There's substitution in the sense that nobody could be the author and pioneer. But the form in which he is the author and pioneer is that he makes all of us his body. So that even when we're persecuted, as Stephen was, he says, Lord, Lord, why, or Paul, why, Saul, why do you persecute me? Or whatever you've done to the least of these, you've done to me. So he's identified himself with us so much that what happens to us happens to him, and vice versa, which is why he can take on death, which is our death, but then we take on his resurrection. So I think that's where I would go with it. Like the substitution is effected as universal solidarity. We couldn't do that on our own, and so in that sense, he substitutes for us. But maybe it's different from penal substitution, if that's understood purely in a sort of
I also
juridical
think it's
way.
important to understand.
Don't worry, I didn't use penal.
Yeah, I figured. Yeah,
I know you're going to get me with that, so I didn't.
No. But the thing is, it's like I think there's a way in which, like, there's a kind of an evasion there of the fact that the cause of the crucifixion is our violence. Like, it's our violence that is the cause of the crucifixion. So, sure. In light of Gethsemane, I think this is an interesting question to ask, because, Christ prays about if there's another way, and Christ was preaching a gospel of the kingdom that was rejected, and not even his disciples understood. What would have happened if the gospel of the kingdom had been accepted and the disciples had understood it?
See, I can still walk with you all the way. So, full disclosure, I'm the bad boy here. I'm a Calvinist.
Yeah, but you're one of my Calvinist friends who I adore.
Yeah, so I can walk all the way with you on that. And one of the things I love about you Universalists is you have a very high view of God's sovereignty, which transcends him just foreknowing, and I love that. And that's not just an incidental thing we have in common. It's something that we can build a huge amount on, because a lot of people have a lot of things in common that actually end up just being more incidental. You can't really build much on, but you can build a lot there. And you guys, there was something else that we have in common. But I do, okay, I really appreciate that. There is some kind of exchange going on, and that's still essential and clear.
Yeah.
And understanding how, there's complexity there. And
I can put it this way, Matt. I don't know if this will help at all, but personally, I'm speaking just totally from my perspective here. So not for Nate necessarily or whatever. I don't know if I would be as confident of a universalist, or even one at all, were it not for the incarnation.
Yeah.
Because for me, that is the fundamental condition of the very possibility of anything like salvation from this world as I know it and as I experience it. And so in that sense, the substitution is in fact just simply the ground of new creation.
Yeah. But to strengthen your argument, JDW, you're not just saying that, you're also saying that he is the pioneer and founder of something.
Right. He's the alpha and the omega in that sense, right? Yeah. He's the totality of it. In fact, that's why he can join himself with every moment of the process in order to effect the total, whole, complete will of God at the end. As the end, actually.
Yeah. But do we want?
I appreciate that. I'm not going to filibuster.
Just one other thought about the substitution and the fairly obvious context of sacrifice. It's like, I don't really. If you're thinking that that what's going on is God's sacrifice of Himself to Himself, that doesn't seem to be quite right. So, part of the substitution is part of what has to be involved in the idea of substitution is we have all of our cultures are built on sacrifice, and we are the ones who are doing the sacrificing.
You're going to get me here too. I know where you're going. You're going to get me here too.
Okay.
For the sake of the chat, let you go.
And so. And their violence because of our inherent violence. So this is actually connected to the remark I made earlier about like Well, the cause of the crucifixion ultimately is our violence. And that causes us to have our inability to escape from sacrifice and violence lead us into things about God that are actually alien to God. So part of what is going on in this substitution is like God becomes the one who sacrifices instead of us to end our need for sacrifice, to change the ground from a ground of scarcity to a ground of plenitude, and also like Christ and submitting to him and going through with being crucified reveals to us like the kind of evil mechanisms that drive our like lowercase world, the closed world, so that we can now see it for what it is. But we still have to get around to at some point the gospel about Jesus is not enough. This goes back to the comment I made earlier about the delay of the parousia. At some point, we have to actually accept the gospel of the kingdom of God that Jesus was preaching and that we rejected.
Yeah. Again, very much with you there.
Okay.
Yeah.
I thought I was being pretty radical and expected pushback. So
no, this is more Nate's the Gandalf the White stuff that you came back from the other side with. That is just great and glorious. So, you're welcome.
Well,
all right, thank you so much. I
good
appreciate
to
it.
talk to you
Thank
as
you,
always,
thank you,
Matt.
JBW, for
Nice
letting
meeting
me
you.
not know who you are. I really appreciate it.
It doesn't matter to me. It's fine. I got kids.
All right.
I'm over that.
Aaron should probably be the last one because we've kept Jordan for over 2 hours, 2.5 hours already.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
First of all, thank you for your knowledge. I think the only thing, and I don't know if this has been addressed yet, but the only thing I can kind of see hell as a metaphysical reality. So I kind of walk my way to affirming it as it exists to a degree, because Jesus says that there is a place outside of him that is of gnashing of teeth, like a place that is like insanity or no life. So my question would be, if I guess the hard thing for me is that I feel like there are things that can be outside of God, like evil is outside of God, and when I can't say when we pass away, where do we go? But as far as this reality here, it seems as though there are things that are, outside of God, if that makes sense.
If something is real and also outside of God, then God doesn't create everything that's real.
Mm-hmm.
And so he's not the sole creator of all that is, was, and shall be. So I would have a metaphysical problem with the idea that outside of God means literally separate, disconnected in every way from God's causal power. Because then we're just saying that God is not the creator of all things. Because you're saying hell's a thing and it's not created by God. Now, if it's created, go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, like a spiritual reality. For example, you just in recent news of like the New Orleans attack, stuff like that, where it's like evil and malice, maybe for a cause that he believed in, as in that was righteous. It seems as though without Christ, there's like sort of, I don't really know how to describe it, but there's no life to it. Like what that person did was evil.
Yeah.
Because I mean, if it could be neutral, I guess it would be like some sort of argument for like there is no God because there are people just doing things. Right. But I see it as the things that person was doing was doomed to fail because it is evil. It doesn't have, God's life, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, I think
Sorry.
no, it's good. I think there's two things. One would be that I do think that evil is a product of the life that God gives us in our ignorance. We can give almost as an act of sacrifice to something that ought not to be. So when someone murders someone or someone does something that's obviously evil, that's not something that God wills, but rather the life that he wills that we ourselves are, and the freedom with which we do develop. I'm not against free will in that sense. We can take that and give our lives almost like a kind of sacrifice of ourselves to bring into being something that, like saying the words of Gregor of Nyssa, something that God did not create. Now the question then becomes: are the evils that are sort of bastardized existences, or like miscarriages of existence itself, will these stand permanently? Will sin perdure forever in its effects forever? Will the reign of Satan and death be just as eternal as God's? And I think to that I would say no. And I would go to the incarnation ultimately, because it's not just, to an earlier point, right? It's not just that God became human and that he took on the likeness of sinful flesh, but per 2 Corinthians, he became sin and a curse for us. So God enters even the evil we ourselves generate in order to destroy it from the inside out. And so in that sense, I think that evil has a sort of provisional temporary existence that we give it, but it will not stand, exactly because of what you said. It does not have the divine life as evil in it in order to be eternal.
That's a good argument. Yeah, there's just some things that I've kind of wondered in my own life of like how to reconcile those kind of things.
Yeah, no, that's a good question.
Thank you for answering.
Yeah, thanks.
Thank you, Aaron. Good to meet you. All right. Well, Jordan, thank you for this. The chat today is just like, wow. I tell you what. It's not normally this bad.
That's just me, man.
I don't know. No. Yeah, but it was real. I really appreciate you coming and doing this. I think it was useful, and I don't think if you want to disagree with me, you're free to disagree with me. But respect that. All I ask is that people respect that this position is it's a moral position, it's a logical position, it's a coherent position, and it has a venerable history in the tradition and shouldn't be just discounted. So.
Yeah, totally. I think it's just a sign of basic decency and good faith on the part of a conversation partner to just be basically familiar with the position you want to critique. And so, for example, if someone thinks that universalism skirts around divine judgment, or that it evacuates all of life of any meaning, even though one of the earliest universalists in Christian tradition was himself a confessor for the faith and died from being tortured because he was Christian, then maybe you just don't actually know the position that well enough to critique it. And at that point, it's just sort of a moral question of whether or not you want to put in the time.
Well, that's the thing. I think there's one thing that we haven't addressed yet. It's like I think a lot of the people who hold to universalism out of belief that they have to.
Yeah.
So it's like they come to the Bible and they do their exegesis and they reason through it, having already adopted a frame that says this must be the case. And so there's a whole bunch of things that they just can't even see.
Right. Yeah. And I was once that way. As I said, I mean, I thought when I first heard just a thumbnail sketch of it, I thought, oh, that's obviously wrong. And
right.
And so but it's one of those things where, yeah, how do you, it's sort of I almost think that like there's less and less reason to not become familiar with it the more and more this gets out and the more and more people talk about it.
Right.
And the more and more like the internet has been a thing, so I don't know. It's I also think this. I'm just gonna throw this out there. I wonder what you think. I think some people, and I have to say, I don't mean this in an entirely negative way, but there's a sort of Protestant reflex that says if somebody holds a belief with such total conviction, then they must want, almost in a dogmatic, threatening way, all others to be where they are at that moment.
Mhm.
Because for a lot of traditions, belief is like everything. You are or are not a Christian based on the detailed sort of beliefs you have. And one thing that I just think some people misunderstand is, like, I myself, for example, I don't think, if I didn't believe in universalism, it would be very difficult for me to believe in God. It is that tied to my faith existentially. It's that tied and practical and ubiquitous in my life every single day.
That's true. That's true in my personal case. It's like I had to come to see that I could believe in God, not that I could believe in the God, like specifically the God that is revealed in the scriptures, that I could believe in that God and be a universalist, and those things were not inconsistent, and in fact were the only source of a really truly robust universalism that is available. I had to come to see that before I could call myself a Christian.
Yeah, exactly. And so, but I think when people hear that, very often it's refracted through a sort of like, oh, so you think nobody else is really Christian or whatever.
Right.
And it's like, no, what I'm saying is I couldn't be that. I mean, it's like, am I allowed to make a sort of statement of personal conviction to that degree without it being automatically threatening to you?
Right.
And that's, I think people just don't, it's like a very flat line. It's always like, no, we're all sort of in the same boat or we're not. And then we sort of fight and stuff.
Yeah.
But yeah, and I think that's, there's a lot of stuff. Like Mark says here, the problem with this argument back and forth between the two sides is that neither grapples adequately with the totality of human experience. That just like doesn't mean anything to me. Like, what are you talking about? The totality of human experience. What's the critique there, right? I mean, it's like, I think that God himself became sin and a curse for us. So little do I think we can get around evil and suffering. But I also think he's resurrected, ascended, and will transfigure all things. So little do I think God is.
Well, the other thing for me is
right?
like Mark. Like the other thing to me with like Mark's thing is like, it's not an argument for me. This is like the single most fundamental moral intuition that I have.
Yeah.
Like, I don't know if you're talking about love and the good, and you include some sort of like eternal perdition in that picture. I don't know what you're talking about.
Yeah, I just don't.
That's not what. If I believe in a God who is wholly good, who is love, then that God is not a God who would do the things that you want to say that he does. That's not an argument. It's like either that's what you see or you don't see.
Right.
So Luke's let's Luke back in.
Let's go back in. He wants to.
Hey, buddy.
Oh man, can you guys hear me? I'm gonna mix that up.
Very well.
Okay. All right. Yeah, I had to come back and say I got to go back and listen to what I missed. But Jordan, thank you very much for this, because I just touched back in and listened to what you guys said and said how it's existentially connected to your belief in God. Yeah. And I don't. There's part of me that. So I really love Peter Rollins. I don't know if you know who he is, Jordan.
I do. Yeah, I do.
Okay, I've been trying to bring him into these conversations forever because I just love that dude.
Getting Jordan and Pete to talk would be kind of.
We have a common Hegelian.
Exactly right.
Yes. Yeah.
Although his is a little left, a little more left than I would like, but yeah.
So I love that stuff. So I wanna affirm a couple things. Like a lot of people's criticism of, like my friend Mitch, my friend Mark. There's a couple identity markers of people who would know me in this space. One is I'm a Christian universalist. I'm also a Christian anarchist, but I also am a just staunch personalist, because I think all this stuff is connected to my understanding of Christianity. I think it's connected to my understanding of the incarnation. And so because I very much love people like Mitch and Mark and all these detractors that push on me, and because I'm a big fan of Peter Rollins and the Church of the Contradiction,
Yeah.
I want to acknowledge, and because of I'm familiar with my own history and my own evolution in kind of a spiral dynamics way of my understanding of these things, I want to be open to, as I say, the truth outside the truth that I currently apprehend.
Sure,
I want to have an existential humility about these things, but simultaneously, I can be open. This is the thing why I think I'm so confusing for people is I have this simultaneous conviction about what I see in regards to universalism and the implications of what that means for God and humanity. And I'm open to that syllogistic propositional structure not being exactly right. But whatever, this is the thing. This is why I say things like iconic thinking. These are probably terms of mine that you don't know. Whatever I mean by how I hold my propositions, I see them as icons. And so even if I'm not saying them the proper way, this is another Rob Bellism. Whatever the thing is behind the thing that I'm trying to point at with my words, like I know it's right. Like I recently rewatched. Are you familiar with the Harry Potter stuff, like that whole world?
I'm about to be. We're about to start book 1 with my kids.
Okay.
Oh.
But I'm not.
So I'm not really either. I know of it a little bit because I've gotten into it from my kids.
I read every single one of them to my kids. So
a Horcrux, the idea of a Horcrux
Right,
is this
that, yeah.
sacred object of which like contains part of your soul.
Mhm.
Goodwill Hunting is a piece of art that's like that for me. It's a Horcrux for me.
Mhm.
I just rewatched it with my 17-year-old recently, and there's a scene in Goodwill Hunting where he have you seen that movie?
Yes. Yeah, it's wonderful.
Where
Yeah.
he goes to where he's working with that math professor, Professor Lambeau, and it's at the end. It's their last scene together, and he does the proof that Lambeau can't do. And Lambeau's like, "Have you considered this? Have you considered this?" He's like, "I don't know what you call it. It's right." He's like, "Take it home. It's right." And then he's just like, "Do you know how easy this is for me? It's a fucking joke." Like that scene. I just feel like call it whatever you want. Like this thing that I mosaically see, that whenever I bring it down, it just falls to pieces and people argue with me. Whatever that thing is, I know is right. I know
Right.
it is. Like I know it as much as I breathe that it's right. And it's like George MacDonald's Lilith, my favorite Lilith quote. I'll say this and shut up, but it's just like, "I'm sorry I can't explain the thing to you. I but barely apprehend it myself. And the fact is there's nothing in you for understanding it. And the
Right.
fact is the first step towards understanding is realizing you don't understand anything, that thing."
Yeah.
That's how I feel. It's just like, I can't explain it to you. And I actually don't think if you could even understand it mechanistically, you'd truly understand it. Because that would be what I call mammonistic knowing, not personal knowing.
Yeah, it would be something other than that. Yeah.
Yeah. And so I love this conversation so much because I think it accurately represents the God that I love. And I don't know, it annoys people. I think it's really, here's the question. Why is it so annoying to people that I like to talk about universalism?
I don't like the hostility in some of the comments. It's like, I mean, it's like y'all gonna talk about your vision all the time, and I don't come around and snipe at you.
I just want to have the time they have, you know.
I don't get it. It's like, okay, disagree with me. That's fine. But why?
This is very true.
But some of the comments are just like really hostile. And Chad, I love you, Chad, but I don't the negativity Chad was bringing today. I didn't get that at all.
I think what Chad is bucking at is the absolutized universalism, the colonizing universalism.
Look, here's the thing. I think people that are typically most supposedly anti-totality, anti-synthesis are just unreflective people. Like, and here's what I mean. I don't mean they're dumb. I don't mean they have low IQ, none of that. What I mean is, who is not doing that? If you say we can never synthesize, we could never know the whole, then you know enough of the whole to know it could never cross the boundary of the fragmentary. How do you know that?
Yes.
How do you know that? Because you too are shooting for the moon. That's why. Why? Because you're a human being. That's what you're supposed to be doing. I mean, I don't think you have a choice but to do that. And someone like Nietzsche gets that. He knows that too. So we transvalue because that's...
speaking of which, I mean, there's a comment just now to tell me to stop calling people nihilists. It's like, I will call people nihilists when what they're saying is
also
nihilism.
Also the thing is, like, nihilism is it's an internally coherent perspective. Like, it doesn't mean it's stupid or dumb or wrong. It's an actual claim on the whole.
You're just exactly right. If you're saying reality is incoherent and incomprehensible, then you're a nihilist.
Yeah.
Let me speak for that. I think the problem is identity, though, and identitarianism, because when you call people nihilists, it feels like an attack or an ad hominem thing, which whatever. That's kind of on them if that's the way it's being received.
But like you could technically, like, this is nihilism.
I would say you are speaking as someone who would affirm the position of nihilism.
It's like the Big Lebowski. These guys are nihilists, man. They don't believe in nothing. Yeah. I mean, look, I don't know. I think it's like, I don't know. Honestly, guys, it's just sort of a lot of, you all know, I mean, people just speak mostly out of their own insecurities. It's just the way it goes. And it's like, if they see you really thinking hard and sort of precise about something, somehow that drums up some insecurity in them. I just can't control that. Like, I don't have time for that. What am I supposed to do with that? I mean, I grew up in an entire tradition that was fundamentally anti-intellectual. I mean, like, you're not going to surprise me with all the reasons why I should stop thinking about God. You're not going to surprise me about all the reasons why we can't know what we know. But you, of course, could know that very securely and absolutely. I mean, that's just all like whatever. It's just a bunch of words to redirect and to divert. I mean, it's like, I don't know. That's like a you problem,
I think that's well said. And I like psychoanalysis a lot, but my last evangelical Protestant pastor said something that I love to quote, which is like, I learned a long time not to judge anybody else's intentions. And I think that's true because I don't know them and likely they don't know them. And so it's kind of a big waste of time.
People sometimes don't know their own intentions, really.
Often.
Yeah.
Actually. Yeah. I mean, I don't either. So,
okay. We have a new person in the back, but I need to make sure I don't know you. And so I have to make sure you're not going to come on and flash pornography. Okay. I see you. I got it.
Good. We're good to Adam.
Geoffrey, what up, buddy?
He's muted.
Yeah, you're muted. You have a question?
Geoffrey.
Nope, we can't hear you, buddy. You're muted. Can I unmute you? No, you're self-muted.
I got you.
There you are.
Oh, here he is.
Yeah,
Hey.
I wasn't really sure what you guys were talking about so much, but I was just wanting to join just to listen because I just joined, obviously.
Where did you? So this is a conversation we're having about questions about hell related to Christian universalism. How didst thou comest here? Through what medium?
YouTube.
Whose channel? Perchance.
I really don't even know. One of the three of you.
Okay. Well, it's either Grail Country or mine, but so I'm always curious as to how people come. Are you familiar with either Grail Country or my channel or the little corner of the internet, or are you just the algorithm?
I think it was just the algorithm just me going to live because I like listening to live conversations.
I gotcha. Well, welcome.
Cool. Can I since we're having a kind of a Q&A type thing now, and I have a friend who's here to ask a question, I'm going to take you. You can stay and listen, but I'm going to remove you from the screen and add my friend Tayo. Okay.
Sounds good.
All right, buddy. Tayo always brings solid oppositional processing. So
don't set me up to fail, Luke. No, I don't. That's not true. Pretty much. For a bit. Firstly, big fan of JDW. I saw you.
I'm a big fan of Tayo. Just wanted to say it really quick. So.
Thank you, Nate.
Yeah,
I saw Jordan basically pull Larry Chap out of the Universalist closets. Rather
I
than-
know. He was way bolder than I was in that conversation. I was like, wow, all right, let's go.
Yeah, but I thought that conversation was great. I don't know if you guys touched on it because I've not been watching it for the past 3 hours fully. But my question that Nate helped me to formulate, I think, touches on why there might be some pushbacks that you guys were speaking on earlier, which was something like, Nate, help me out. What's the spiritual usefulness of promoting universalism? I think that's something like that was what we said.
Let me actually, I think I have it in the notepad here. Yeah. Okay, so this is actually how we kind of like worked it out together. So the question Matteo had was, if universalism is true, is it spiritually wise to proclaim? Which is, we kind of touched on that a little bit earlier when we talked about the kind of early church tendency to like kind of privately hold the universalist positions but not want to put it to the public. So what do you think?
Well, I think the usefulness is that some people. I'll just tell a story about this. One time, I had a pretty good friend who had just gotten married, and they were thinking about having a child, and then they eventually did get pregnant. And he called me one day and asked if he could drive like 5 hours to my house to talk to me because he was in such despair. And the despair was, now maybe a lot of people don't relate to this, but the despair was he couldn't imagine the guilt of bringing somebody into the world that might, and in fact, in the end, if the person might end up in eternal conscious torment forever. And so what he was struggling with was the way that eschatology, I think if thought rightly, immediately and directly affects our day-to-day existential perception of God. And in this case, it was overwhelming him to the point where he couldn't pray, he couldn't do anything, he couldn't go to work. Now, there could be other things as well, and this is an extreme case. But he did come. We talked for 7 hours that day, and now they have 4 children. So I like to take credit for their but it's like, it's an example of like, the question of whether or not God is truly good is actually one that nobody avoids. This is what I was saying earlier and
it's a question that no one is always answering in the affirmative or always
right.
answering in the negative, right?
Exactly. Yeah. And so now different issues might strike different people in different ways. All the hubbub around how to read certain parts of scripture, whether or not you can read them literally or allegorically. I mean, all these things were, like in the church fathers, explicitly things that raise the question of whether or not God, in light of this depiction, is good. And the question, that's not an academic question merely. The question is God reliable and trustworthy such that he will solicit my faith? And when Jesus says in Matthew 7 to compare our fathers and parents to God as your father in prayer, if you, even though you're not good and wicked, give good gifts to your children who give to it, how much more will your Father in heaven give those, right? What he's telling you to do is to think of God as an utterly good father. When 1 John says God is love or God is light, it's telling you to think of God as love and light. And so those are the things, like it's actually because of belief in those things that then when I encounter a difficult passage in scripture, a difficult circumstance in history, or a difficult ending to the story supposedly that we're telling, then it's the very conviction that surely God is good, is light, is merciful, is infinitely, all these things that I believe about God because I've been told to. Those are the very things that drive my specific questions about, say, universalism. Now, it might not strike everybody that way, right? I'm not here saying everybody has to care about this the same amount as I do, right? Like I myself didn't always care about it the same amount as I do now, right? So it isn't like that. I mean, I'm not the one making those sorts of claims, but like, but for me, that's what I would say. So why I think this is becoming more and more of an open thing rather than earlier is, well, one is just honestly the time we live in. for two reasons. There is just the openness of like this. We're all in very different parts of the world. Things are not as easily tied up in so-and-so's commentary on Romans that only the very few literate people will even have access to. No, now everybody has access to almost anything. So these things are just not going away, number one. So we may as well address them directly. And then number two, this is, look, we don't live in the time of Origen. We don't even live in the time of the Cappadocian Fathers or of Maximus for that matter. And there's an entire history of reasons not to believe in God or to believe in Christianity because of the baggage all of those things have brought over the centuries. And so as it gets harder and harder to believe in God and to believe in Christ, then I think it makes more and more sense that considering things that do or do not make God attractive or his beauty manifest are more and more pressing for people. I don't know if that makes sense at all. I mean, I can't prove this, right?
I think that a lot of that made sense, and I appreciate the way in which you explain that. I think I sort of took three things from that. I want to click in, double click on one of them, but the three things I sort of picked up was, firstly, sort of it lessens the load of the spiritual journey with that if you live in a universalist world rather than a one with eternal conscious torment, which is a crazy name, but nonetheless. And the second thing was that's the second thing as well. I'll come back to. I want to double click on, but it's the advent of the internet and the information deluge that we're currently living. And the third one I think was actually really great, which is just there are new objections that the Christian traditions as old answers for that are re-emerging. I think I like that framing of it. But the second one I want to double click on, the internet of it all. Is there not and you've read this more than I would, was there a conscious effort by the Universalist early church fathers to sort of keep that hidden, or is it more so a technological thing that stopped them from being preaching? And I asked that because is there a lost wisdom that we're not considering because we've got the tool of the internet to talk about anything that we want to talk about, of talking about too many things public?
Well, I mean, I think it's I think in the actual historical case of the early Christians, I don't think it was uniformly the case that a Christian Universalist, even at that time, would want to keep it hush-hush. Gregory of Nyssa has it in his catechetical orations for new Christians. So when they're coming to the church and he's giving them 25, 26 lectures on what the Christian faith is, more or less going through the creed, he says the devil will be saved in those lectures. So he apparently didn't think it was something that newcomers can't ever handle. However, there were other people that would disagree. So in a sense, it's sort of like an intra-universalist prudential judgment kind of thing, right? And some would say, no, we should kind of keep it to ourselves, sort of venerable silence over these things. And other people would say, actually, it's pretty integral to what Christ was doing when he harrowed hell. And to see the goodness of Christ's entire life, death, and resurrection, you have to see how effective it truly is. And so, that's a dispute maybe people would have. The point, though, about the internet in the modern era is that it almost reframes those questions in a way that they could not have conceived of back then, precisely because if they really did all agree that the prudential thing to do always and everywhere was to keep this under wraps, they could do that fairly easily. Right? Because if you can't read and you don't have time or leisure to do that, then whatever's tucked away in book 5 of Origen's commentary on Romans won't be out in the masses, So, whereas I just think, kind of in a sense, for good or for ill, right? The dam is broken. My students do know about some controversial things in attacks on Christianity, whether I like it or not. So what am I going to do? Not address it? Or like my buddy who teaches in Catholic seminary, He's got seminarians coming to him objecting to very basic, actually fundamental Vatican II teachings based on YouTuber whoever who says that the Catholic Church was infiltrated and it's gone downhill since then, right? So what is he going to do? Not address? So I just mean in that sense, like materially, we're at a point where maybe not addressing it or not talking about it is less of an option than it once was.
Okay. All right.
I think, and also one of the factors in the need to address it is, I think that as we are moving closer and closer to final participation, this comes back to the whole point I was making earlier about us being the cause of the delay of the parousia. It's like, it's at some point, like, we have to begin to take seriously the gospel of Jesus as well as the gospel about Jesus. And one of the things that infernalism does, it tends to make it so that being saved, being not going to hell is the only thing that matters. And it's like, okay, I'm not going to hell, I'm good. And that means that when that's your view, then you never actually engage with the real work that God has for you.
Yeah, and I think in that sense, then the question needs to be turned around and asked of infernalism. What's the spiritual use of it?
That's exactly my point. Yeah.
I mean, for one thing, even just on a practical level, I think I mentioned this earlier, it didn't seem to work in Western Europe or Christendom, which is now mostly post-Christian, even though the predominant eschatology for hundreds of years was infernalism. So why aren't they all still Christian if it's so effective and useful and integral to Christianity? So I don't think it actually works. And in fact, the other thing is there's a lot of papering over, not you, Tyler, but I just mean like other people I've talked to that have raised this. What kind of psychological and spiritual damage has that doctrine actually done on a lot of people? I mean, Charles Taylor talks about the decline of hell as a major factor in like anti-Christian 19th century, 20th century polemic against Christianity. And you can read it if you just go read Diderot or whatever, right? Voltaire. So it's also become a cause of scandal in the other direction, infernalism. So is it wise to proclaim that, right? So these things get kind of,
Can I? I'm gonna do it anyway. It's a fool's errand because you've thought about this way more than I probably ever have. But just to attempt to answer that challenge and also to give some background to why I asked the question that I asked is, I'm thinking in the context of Sunday school.
Yeah.
I was a Sunday school teacher, and there is something to the story presentation of the gospel that necessitates the judge at the end to say yes, no, and it's I've heard you talk about your universalism enough to know that it doesn't do away with judgment. It doesn't do away with having to the consequences of the way in which you live.
Mm-hmm.
But past that, it gets very complicated in a way that's not very easy to teach to children. Now, Nate brought up the point about the gospel of Jesus versus the gospel of the story of Jesus. The story is usually a lot easier to grasp than the theology. And in the context of, again, back to the Sunday school, it's very easy for them to grasp the concept of God the Father as the God who says, the God who judges. Now, the final judgment of how that plays out, I think, leaning the other way of at the end of the day, it sends you to heaven or hell. I think that's also, I think you're right to critique that, but I don't think there's a clear and easy story to be told, even though I give a beautiful picture of what the gospel is in the universalist perspective.
So a few points. That's great points. One is that I am not insisting that universalism is taught everywhere, always, at every age. My own kids don't know what that is, and so I don't, now, as my 10-year-old did not long ago, if she comes home, because she learned that some people are going to go to hell, and what about those Christians or non-Christian family members? Well, now we're at a different point, right? I didn't come in here with a lesson that says, here's universalism, guys. You need to understand this, fifth graders, Instead, though, it came from her own actual life organically. And at that point, I would address it. Or like, say, the way that the kinds of questions and concerns my 20-year-old students here at the university have, that's a different setting. And I do actually present, but all sides. I don't just present that one. And I also think too, like, in a way, what you're articulating, like, I agree with you. I think everybody has to struggle with those, though. There are very few infernalist preachers. There are some, of course, that make everything about hell. But my preacher didn't growing up. But he was definitely an infernalist. But he was still making the judgment. He's not going to say, imagine this, everyone's burning in hell, whatever, right? And most of my pastors and ministers growing up didn't do that, even though none of them were universalist. And so everybody's making those judgments. And so I don't think whether you're a universalist or infernalist, you're not really avoiding that. It's not inherent to one or the other. And then the last point I would make is scripture itself, even if you're just telling the story, tell it long enough and we'll see how far we can avoid these questions, right? Because it's like, how far are we going to tell the story? Are we going to get to Revelation 21, 22? Every tear will wipe away. There will be the healing of the nations will come from the lead, right? And then somebody pipes up, well, hold on. Won't I remember my grandfather who's burning in hell because he wasn't a Christian and he was an atheist? How will I not be crying? Well, now so the story itself will raise the questions. I have no doubt about that.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank
Luke
you,
and Nate, any thoughts before I jump off?
So did you guys cover
everything?
Yeah, everything. I don't because I was saying this to Tayo in the chat when I wasn't on, but I don't know. I don't understand the insecurity that people have, or seeming insecurity about openly, and whatever, proselytizing is one thing, but openly professing belief, even from the pulpit, of universalism. Like, why is it okay for the ECT proponents or even for annihilationism, but not for universalists? I mean, that's something I don't understand. And then to sort of what you were just saying, Jordan, I remember when I was first exposed to mystical theology and the theology of the Eastern Church, and first annihilationism and then universalism, and I still struggle with that to this day, because the Bible talks about, be careful you who desire to teach, because you will be judged more strictly. Why didn't my teachers in the faith ever tell me these things? Like, I feel frustrated about that. I don't think they were doing it to protect me. I mean, I think they were doing it, again, assuming the best of intentions, that they were just teaching what they think so clearly the Bible taught. But I think it was largely because they were ignorant of this stuff.
And afraid a little bit.
And afraid. And that's like, I
think, Luke, I think that's like, I think there's a reason why I think most universalists are autodidactic types, because that's true. It's just like, it's not like, it's really hard to find it being taught. And so if you're going to, it's something that you have to discover on your own. In my case, like, that discovery, like, made me want to maybe realize, that I've been a Christian all along, and that I wanted to embrace that identity of being a Christian and return to church. But no one taught me it. I had to find it on my own, because of my own autodidact tendencies.
I think that is the answer to your question, Luke. What Nate's just said, because one, to me, just the zeitgeist understanding of what universalism is basically the straw man that you spent the last 3 days trying to iron out before the stream itself, and then it still showed up in the stream and in the chat and all of the
Despite my best efforts.
I know, but it's because that's unless you've actually done the work yourself of going through that journey and ending up there, that's all you're able to conceive of this mystical, magical. It feels too ex nihilo. It's too clean. If you've not actually gone through the work of getting to the point of where it's not just everything's going to be fine in the end and the story is good, blah blah blah.
Yeah, I think it's the difference between the Unitarian Universalist message. Like, it's terrifyingly beautiful. It's terrifying.
Right. You know, I think that's why it's really good you decided to start with that MacDonald quote, I think, at least in the way I wanted to read the MacDonald quote, because like one of the problems that we run into as universalists trying to communicate is that people have already pre-committed to a frame where it's impossible for them to see it. It's just automatically like something their frame will not allow them to see.
What's funny is that at the same time that's happening, Nate, and I guess you could suspect me as lying, but I get messages weekly from people who are the exact opposite, that they've been agony over all this stuff. And they found me because it's like, look, I always say, like, I'm willing to talk about it because it's been so central to me. There's a lot of things that I think that probably would be like, not everybody would love, but I don't make it a point to go out and talk about everything just because I want to be an edgelord or whatever. It's like, it's because it's been so actually helpful to so many different kinds of people, and not just, it's all across ecumenical, lots of different people from different backgrounds at different stages. That like I still weekly get messages about this. I've never even written anything on the topic. I'm just willing to talk about it. I'm going to write something now, but all that was like, I didn't set out to do that.
Right.
It's just like, so it's funny because I think that too creates the friction, is because you're right. There's a still dominant majority of people who just can't even like see the, like,
right.
it's they're closed off.
Well, I think a lot of those people, Jordan, that are coming to you, I totally believe in their sincerity, and I've had those kinds just from Grail Country. I've had the same kind of reactions from my work on Grail Country, and what usually those are people who are like, they're on the edge of deconstruction, so their frame is beginning to loosen, and they're actually looking for a new frame because the frame that they have isn't working for them. Then they're able to see it.
Yeah.
But as long as people think like, I have this perfect frame, everything's in order, there's nothing that I need to look at that's outside my frame, I've got it, boom. I mean, those they're never gonna. That's why it's pointless to debate them.
Well,
they're never going to see it.
They're never going to see it because of the reason and the rationality, but they might see it because of the medium of the relation and the love that's exercised within that. Yeah. I think. And so that's why it's God is he about whom we must never speak, and we must always keep speaking. And everything's that way. It doesn't mean you're going to get there because of the mechanism of reason or logic, but that doesn't mean that those propositions aren't true in as much as they're pointing at the truth.
And I think too, like, your guys' goal in this whole thing, which is the laudable one, is the same one I have like in my Christian doctrine class, intro to Christian theology class. I end the course with the question, who will be saved in the end? And I present all of them, and we read different people from different perspectives. I'll say, I don't even know if 50% of my students actually agree with me in the end.
Right.
Because I don't present it as like, this is obviously the only way.
Yeah,
I give the full thing, but the one thing I do get, and I know this because we talk about it in the roundtable at the end, even people that are like raised, like in my context, it's a lot of it's like Southern Baptists, like, and they were like, this, I've never heard anything like this. Even if they're like, I'm not really there, I don't really think that, I still think it's wrong, they at least, almost all of them to a person, at least are like, but man, I kind of hope that's true.
Right. Yeah.
And I'm like, look, if you just are there, if you can even just see the glimpse of why someone would hope that that's true, even if you think it's impossible that it could be because you think you're reading the Bible so completely transparent, then I still consider that a kind of like progress.
Well, I actually think hoping that it's true is actually just a flat out obligation. Like,
well, I would
think,
agree. I agree, of course.
I mean,
certainly it isn't the Catholic.
I don't know what you're doing with your Christianity if you can't even bring yourself to hope for it.
Yeah, I can't really make sense of that either.
I can't answer for anyone else, but I can answer that for myself, because I'm very much there with the open, and I'm fearful of creating a God of my own understanding that's only of my own understanding.
Right.
Like it feels almost too good to be true in a way that feels too good to be true. And if that is not too good to be true, then I'll have to assume the posture that you, Nate, and Jordan have said of, if this isn't Christianity, I don't want it. And I'm not willing to let go of Christianity for a more beautiful version of Christianity that I'm imagining.
I don't know that it's possible to believe something that you don't most hope for.
We've got someone else in the queue. I'll jump off now to let Pickens on. Thank you guys so much.
Good to see you, Tayo.
See you, Tayo. We got somebody who's been in the comments for a long time, and they're breaking the fourth wall.
Thank you. I'm glad that he's. But this really needs to be our last one. My gosh, we're at 3.5 hours. Jordan's got other things to do, I'm sure.
I got an entire class that I'm supposed to start teaching in a week that I haven't started planning. So there we go.
Okay, well, we need to get you out of here soon then.
Just tell them to watch this.
It's just that I actually like this stuff, so you know.
Yeah, good tell.
JD,
All
what
right.
up?
I'll try to make it quick because I came in here at the last minute over here, but I was actually like doing some dishes and stuff. Listening, I was like, I just wanted to express a couple things because someone brought up, I think it was Teo brought up an understandable question about even if it's true, what's the practical usefulness of propagating the idea of universalism. And speaking for myself, it's what allows me to have hope.
Yeah, right.
Amen.
And I don't think we give enough credit a lot of times to the carrot when it comes to the carrot and the stick.
Right.
Like we don't give God's love and his beauty enough credit for being able to draw us in. And I know like last year, my mother passed. Well, now it's like 2023. My mother passed away suddenly. And she was sort of like my main source of like all my faith questions and everything. She always had something comforting to tell me. She passed away, and I'm like, I'm sort of like I'm a Catholic, but I'm a major cafeteria Catholic, and I'm like, well, I need to like go, try to have a good confession so I can take communion at my mom's funeral. And I just start doing some research and everything, and I suddenly learning all this stuff about like how easy it is to like go to hell, and you start thinking about everybody that you care about that's never going to make it, and like by most infernalist standards, and like that doesn't draw you in. Like that doesn't. Oh, then I better do extra good so I can make it in. It doesn't matter, because if I make it, I'm in hell anyway, because everybody I care about isn't there, and so that throws you into a state of like, I don't want any of this to be real, because I don't want my auntie who doesn't go to church to go to hell. I don't want, you know what I mean? All that stuff is what makes you excited for that moment before I started reading so much, for that moment where I was finally like feeling, and I have these waves throughout my whole life. I have these waves, and I get these waves of like being away from church and then feeling drawn to God because something gives me hope. Something makes like that aroma of God's love becomes powerful, and I'm so excited to get closer to God. And I go to church, then I get to church and I get hit with all this nonsense that just makes me feel like someone's putting a gun to my head. And I'm like, I don't want to be there anymore, and I think like making the news good is what draws people to want to emulate the good. Being in love with God and in love with his love is what inspires us to be like that. Like if you're a Star Wars fan and you want to be like Luke Skywalker, it's not because not being like Luke Skywalker is going to make you go to hell. It's like you're inspired. My hero growing up was Barry Sanders. Like I spent so much time outside in the yard practicing those moves because I was inspired, not because I was threatened. Like when we're inspired, we don't give enough credit to the power of being inspired by love. And when you're conditioned to move in love, the consequences of hurting a person is there. It's like when you realize you hurt somebody or you did something wrong, that love within you hurts. That's your consequence. Mm-hmm. And if you don't have that love that motivates you as your motivation, then all the rules and all the infernalism in the world isn't going to help you out one iota, because you're not doing it out of love anyway. And ultimately, we're talking about a God who can see our hearts. That's it. I'm done. I just wanted to let that out.
That was maybe a super good way to close it out. By the way, you're awesome.
That needs to be
right
clipped.
on.
That needs to be clipped for sure. One of us has to clip that and just use that as a short, because that was so perfect.
I'll do it. I'll clip it and throw it on my channel. Yeah.
I appreciate you guys.
Yeah,
and I appreciate you, Jordan, too. I follow all three of you guys, and you guys have been helping me get through this time where I'm like, grieving and everything. So I appreciate y'all.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
God bless, dude, brother.
All
right. Well, so Jordan, thanks a lot, man. This has been really good. I hope we could do more of these. I'm sure we will, God willing, in the future. Nate, thank you as always.
Yeah.
There was somebody who said this in the comments. Like I grew up not being able to have these conversations. There's no capacity in any of the spaces I grew up to talk about anything like this, and it made me. I mean, I don't know. I was so repressed. I didn't even feel alone because I was coping so hard.
I'm a very lucky man these days, because one of the people in the comments earlier was Father Joe, who happens to be my priest. So
yeah, he's a stud for sure.
He is amazing. Yeah.
So all right, I'm gonna shut her down. Sound good?
All right. Thanks, everybody.
Okay. Thanks, guys.
Peace.